I am Harold, 70 years old, and somehow still breathing after the people I loved most tried to bury me alive. As a retired construction contractor who quietly built a real estate empire, I thought I had secured my family's future. I was wrong. 3 days after my son's lavish wedding, my phone rang. It was the restaurant manager. He sounded terrified. He told me he rechecked the VIP room security camera footage and that I needed to see it myself immediately. Then he whispered, "Please come alone, and whatever you do, do not tell your wife anything." I simply gripped the phone and nodded to an empty room. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood in Chicago taught me the value of sweat and silence. But inside my own sprawling estate, that silence was weaponized against me. The air in the grand ballroom was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and imported champagne. I stood silently in the shadow of a marble pillar, watching my son Nicholas spin his new bride Samantha across the polished dance floor. They looked like royalty draped in designer silk and tailored velvet. My wife Patricia glided through the crowd, radiating the kind of rehearsed elegance that took decades to perfect. As the photographer began gathering the immediate family for the main portrait, I stepped forward, straightening my dark suit. Patricia intercepted me immediately. Her manicured hand clamped onto my forearm with surprising force. She snatched the glass of sparkling water from my hand and pushed me back toward the shadows. "Do me a favor and stand over by the wall," she hissed, her smile never leaving her face for the flashing cameras. "You have spent your entire life covered in brick dust and cement. Do not ruin my son's high society image in front of his new in-laws looking like a cheap relic." I froze, the insult sliding between my ribs like a familiar blade. The crushing irony was that her diamond necklace, the vintage champagne flowing freely, and the $50,000 ballroom rental had all been paid for quietly by my black card. I built my fortune from the ground up, turning a small contracting business into a quiet commercial real estate empire. I never flaunted it, believing a man provides without seeking applause. But my humility was mistaken for uselessness. Swallowing the humiliation, I turned and walked out the back doors of the venue before the cake was even cut. I drove home alone in the dark, leaving my wife and son to celebrate their perfect night. I thought that was the worst pain a father could feel. I had no idea what was actually happening after I walked out those doors. 3 days later, the morning sun was beating down on my neck as I trimmed the hedges in our backyard. The physical labor kept my mind off the coldness of my own home. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was Oscar, the manager of the restaurant where the wedding reception was held. I answered, expecting a question about a lingering vendor invoice. Instead, his voice came through, hurried and trembling. "Harold, you need to come to my office right now," he urged. "We were doing a routine backup of the security cameras from the VIP lounge on the night of the wedding. You need to see this footage yourself. Please come alone, and Harold, whatever you do, do not tell your wife anything." The urgency in his tone made my blood run cold. Oscar was not an alarmist. 10 years ago, when the banks were ruthlessly foreclosing on commercial properties, I quietly bought the debt on his restaurant and restructured it so he would not lose his life's work. His loyalty to me was absolute. If he was calling me with this level of panic, something was terribly wrong. I hung up the phone and walked into the house, grabbing my car keys from the counter. Patricia was sitting at the kitchen island, sipping her morning tea while scrolling through her phone. "I am running to the hardware store to pick up some fertilizer," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. Patricia did not even look up at first, just gave a dismissive wave of her hand. But as I walked out the front door and climbed into my truck, I glanced at the rearview mirror. Patricia was standing at the large bay window, the curtain pulled slightly back, watching my vehicle with a cold, calculating, and piercing stare. A heavy knot formed in my stomach. She was watching me like a warden watches a prisoner. I arrived at the restaurant and was immediately ushered through the kitchen corridors into Oscar's cramped security office. He locked the heavy metal door behind us, his face pale and sweating. He did not say a word. He just pointed a shaking finger at the glowing computer monitor. He hit play. The grainy footage was from the private VIP room, time-stamped at 2 a.m. hours, after the last wedding guests had gone home. The room was mostly empty, except for 4 people sitting around a low table. Patricia, Nicholas, Samantha, and Douglas, the slick financial advisor I had trusted with managing my liquid assets for the past 5 years. My heart stopped beating as I watched Patricia lean across the table and kiss Douglas passionately on the mouth, her hands tangled in his hair. My son Nicholas did not even flinch. He just raised his glass of whiskey, clinking it against Samantha's glass in a celebratory toast. I felt physically sick, but the audio feed Oscar had managed to isolate turned my nausea into pure primal terror. Douglas leaned back, wiping lipstick from his mouth. "I have the new prescription," he said smoothly. "The antipsychotic drops are tasteless and odorless. If you slip them into his daily vitamin water every morning, his cognitive decline will drastically accelerate within 4 weeks." Patricia laughed, a cruel, sharp sound that echoed in the tiny security office. "He already thinks he is just getting forgetful. Once the hallucinations start, the judge will grant us emergency medical conservatorship without a second thought." Nicholas chimed in, leaning forward with a greedy smirk. "And once we have his power of attorney, we transfer the deeds of his commercial real estate portfolio directly to my holding company. Then we lock the old man up in a high-security asylum and throw away the key. My own flesh and blood. The son I raised, the wife I provided for sitting in a room I paid for, laughing about scrambling my brain with drugs so they could steal my life's work and lock me in a padded cell." Oscar paused the video, looking at me with absolute horror. "Douglas sent a man here an hour ago with an envelope of cash offering to pay me to wipe the servers completely," Oscar whispered. "I took the money to play along, but I made a backup on a secure drive. Harold, your life is in immediate danger." The drive back home felt like navigating through a suffocating nightmare. The woman I slept next to for decades was actively trying to destroy my mind. The son I taught how to walk was planning to throw me into a cage, but the shock had quickly burned away, leaving behind a cold, blinding clarity. I parked the truck, took a deep breath, and walked through the front door. The house was quiet, perfectly manicured, a beautiful facade hiding a nest of vipers. I walked straight into the dining room. Patricia was waiting for me. She had set out a fresh plate of sliced fruit and a tall glass of water. Beside the glass sat my small white vitamin pills, exactly as she had prepared them for me every morning for the past month. "You were gone a while, Harold," she said. Her voice was dripping with that rehearsed, sickening sweetness. "Sit down and take your brain vitamins. You know how foggy your memory has been getting lately. We need to keep you sharp." I looked at her face. I saw the fake concern crinkling her eyes. I saw the monster hiding behind the mask of a loving wife. I smiled back, pulling out my chair and sitting down. "You are always taking such good care of me, Patricia," I replied, picking up the glass and the pills. I raised the glass to my lips, tossing the pills into my mouth. She watched me swallow, a microscopic glint of triumph flashing in her eyes. She turned her back to place the fruit bowl in the refrigerator. In that split second, I coughed into my closed fist, silently spitting the intact pills into the linen napkin resting on my lap, swiftly tucking the fabric into my pocket. I swallowed the plain water and set the glass down with a satisfied sigh. She turned back around, her smile widening. It was in that exact moment I realized the depth of the battlefield I had just stepped onto. Her sweetness was a literal death scythe hovering over my neck. I needed to get these pills to an independent lab immediately to secure criminal evidence against them. But as I stood up to excuse myself to the garage, Patricia stepped into the doorway, blocking my path. "Nicholas and Samantha are coming over for dinner tonight, and I need you here to help me prepare." She stated, her tone shifting from a request to an absolute command. "You are not leaving this house again today, Harold." My heart hammered against my ribs. I was trapped in a house with my executioners carrying the poison in my pocket, and the walls were rapidly closing in. Patricia remained in the doorway for several seconds, making it perfectly clear that I was no longer free to move through my own life without her permission. I forced my shoulders to relax and gave her the tired smile of a husband too exhausted to argue. "Of course," I said. "I will stay and help." Her eyes searched my face, looking for resistance. When she found none, she stepped aside. I walked slowly toward the kitchen, keeping one hand inside my jacket pocket. The linen napkin containing the untouched pills felt heavier than a brick. It was the first physical evidence I possessed, but evidence was worthless if Patricia found it before I could place it in trustworthy hands. For the rest of the afternoon, she remained within sight of me. She instructed me to polish the wine glasses, arrange the dining table, and carry serving dishes from the pantry. Every few minutes, she glanced in my direction, studying the steadiness of my hands and the sharpness of my attention. She was not watching a husband help prepare dinner. She was monitoring a patient whose mind she expected to deteriorate. I deliberately moved more slowly than usual. Once I stopped in front of the silverware drawer and stared into it as though I had forgotten what I was looking for. Patricia watched from across the kitchen. "What is wrong now?" she asked. "I cannot remember where we keep the serving spoons." Her expression softened into false concern, but I caught the satisfaction beneath it. "They are right in front of you, Harold." I looked down and allowed embarrassment to cross my face. "Of course they are." She touched my shoulder with the gentle patience of a nurse caring for a confused old man. "You should listen to me when I tell you to take your vitamins." I lowered my head and nodded. That small performance bought me the first opening I needed. When Patricia went upstairs to change before dinner, I entered the laundry room and locked the door. I removed the napkin from my pocket and carefully placed the pills inside a clean plastic storage bag. I wrapped that bag inside a second one, pressed out the air, and sealed it with heavy tape. Then I pulled an old prepaid phone from behind a loose panel beneath the utility sink. I had purchased it several months earlier for construction emergencies and never told Patricia it existed. The number was not connected to any family account, shared cloud service, or financial application Douglas could monitor. I called Oscar. He answered before the second ring. "Are you safe?" he asked. "For the moment." "Did you get a sample? I have 3 intact pills." There was a brief silence. "I know a private laboratory," Oscar said. "They handle confidential testing for several medical offices and criminal defense firms. They will document the chain of custody." "I cannot leave the house. Patricia is watching me." Oscar thought for several seconds. "Put the sample inside something she will not examine." I looked around the laundry room. Shelves of cleaning products lined the wall. Near the back sat an unopened cardboard container, holding replacement water filters for the restaurant-grade refrigerator Patricia had insisted on buying. "I have a box that came from one of your suppliers," I said. "The label still carries your restaurant's delivery information. Seal the sample inside it. I will send one of my maintenance men to the house tomorrow morning. He will say the filters were recalled because of a manufacturing defect, and if she refuses to let him inside, he does not need to come inside. You only need to hand him the box." I ended the call, removed one of the filters from its packaging, and concealed the sealed pills inside the hollow cardboard support beneath it. I closed the container and returned it to the shelf. By the time Patricia came downstairs, I was standing at the kitchen counter, cutting vegetables as though nothing had happened. Nicholas and Samantha arrived shortly after 7. They entered the house carrying expensive wine they had probably purchased with money indirectly taken from me. Nicholas gave me a quick, distracted nod. Samantha did not bother greeting me at all. She immediately joined Patricia near the dining table, where the 3 of them spoke in hushed tones whenever they believed I was too far away to hear. During dinner, Patricia placed another glass of water beside my plate. 2 white pills rested on the saucer. "Do not forget these," she said. Nicholas glanced toward me. "You have been forgetting a lot lately, Dad." His concern sounded rehearsed. I picked up the pills, pretended to place them on my tongue, and raised the glass. This time I trapped the tablets between my cheek and gum. I swallowed the water, coughed into my fist, and later deposited the pills into a folded piece of wax paper hidden inside my trouser pocket. Every dose they attempted to give me was another piece of evidence. After dinner, I intentionally called Nicholas by the wrong name. "Daniel, would you carry those plates into the kitchen?" Nicholas stopped moving. "My name is Nicholas." I stared at him for 2 uncomfortable seconds. "Of course it is." Patricia and Samantha exchanged a quick look. The expression passing between them was not fear. It was triumph. They believed the drugs were succeeding. The next morning, a white service van pulled into the driveway shortly after 9. The words, "Kitchen Equipment Maintenance," were printed on its side. A man wearing gray work clothes walked toward the front entrance carrying a clipboard. Patricia answered the door before I could reach it. "We did not request service," she said sharply. The man glanced at his paperwork. "I am collecting a recalled refrigerator filter. The supplier records show that your unit received one from the affected production batch. There is nothing wrong with our refrigerator. The defect is internal, ma'am. The company is replacing them at no charge." Patricia was suspicious of everyone, but the possibility of receiving something free appealed to her sense of entitlement. She turned toward me. "Harold, get the filter box from the laundry room." I shuffled down the hallway, retrieved the prepared container, and carried it back with both hands. The maintenance worker checked the label, signed his clipboard, and placed the box into the sealed equipment case. Before leaving, he looked directly at me. "The replacement will arrive within 48 hours, sir." It was an ordinary sentence, but I understood the message. The sample was safely out of the house. For the next 2 days, I continued swallowing water and hiding the pills. I placed each recovered dose into a separate dated envelope. I wrote the time, location, and circumstances on the back using a small pencil hidden inside my workshop. During those 48 hours, memories I had dismissed as signs of aging began returning with brutal clarity. 8 weeks earlier, I had driven halfway to a commercial property inspection before realizing I could not remember why I was in the car. A month later, I had found my truck keys inside the pantry beside a bag of flour. Twice, I had awakened in the middle of the night with my heart pounding, convinced I had heard voices coming from an empty hallway. Patricia had stood beside me during every episode. She had stroked my arm, spoken softly, and told me not to worry. "You are getting older," she would say. "These things happen." I had believed her because trusting her was easier than accepting that my own mind might be failing. Now I understood. Those moments had not been ordinary lapses. They were the early results of a deliberate chemical assault. On the 3rd afternoon, the prepaid phone vibrated beneath the loose panel in the laundry room. Oscar had sent only 4 words. "The report is ready." I locked the door and called him. His voice was controlled, but the anger beneath it was unmistakable. The laboratory confirmed the tablets contain a high-dose antipsychotic sedative, normally prescribed only under strict psychiatric supervision. In someone without the diagnosed condition, repeated exposure can produce severe confusion, memory disruption, tremors, disorientation, and hallucinations. I pressed my free hand against the washing machine to steady myself. How much would it take to create the symptoms I have been experiencing? "The laboratory cannot determine exactly how many doses you received," Oscar said, "but the concentration in each tablet is far beyond anything that should be disguised as a vitamin." Did they document everything? Photographs, weight, chemical composition, the original packaging, the transfer from my employee, and the sealed delivery to the laboratory. Nothing was left informal. He paused. "Harold, this proves someone gave you dangerous medication. It does not prove who placed it in your glass." I already understood that limitation. Patricia could claim the tablets belonged to me. Douglas could produce a fraudulent prescription. Nicholas could insist he had never seen the bottle. A laboratory report established the weapon, but not the hand that used it. I need them recorded admitting what they are doing, I said. Yes, and I need proof that the medication is connected to their attempt to take control of my estate. Yes. I looked toward the locked laundry room door. On the other side, Patricia was moving through the house, confident that every dose was pushing me closer to legal helplessness. She did not know I had stopped taking the pills. She did not know the laboratory had identified them. And she did not know that the symptoms she expected to see from that moment forward would be entirely under my control. Oscar arranged for the toxicology report to be delivered electronically to a secure account. When I opened the document on the prepaid phone, the language was clinical and precise. No accusations, no emotion, just chemical facts printed in black letters. For weeks, Patricia had used those tablets to make me doubt my own mind. Now those same tablets had given me the first weapon capable of destroying her story. But the report alone would not stop the conservatorship petition. If Douglas and Patricia had already begun creating false medical records, they might reach the court before I could expose them. I needed someone who understood how to move assets, challenge guardianship fraud, and act without alerting the financial advisor monitoring my accounts. There was only one attorney I trusted to operate outside Douglas's reach, Timothy Dawson. By noon the following day, I was sitting across from Timothy Dawson in his high-rise office. Timothy was a legal shark who answered to no one but me. I sat in his high-rise office staring at the sprawling city skyline I had literally helped build from the ground up. Timothy did not offer me a drink or engage in small talk. He simply slid a thick, heavy manila folder across the polished mahogany desk. His face was entirely devoid of its usual arrogant confidence. He looked at me with a mixture of professional grimness and personal disgust. "Harold, they are not just trying to drug you," Timothy said, his voice dropping an octave. "They are trying to legally erase you." I opened the folder. The documents inside were copies of a petition filed in civil court that very morning. Patricia and Douglas were officially requesting an emergency medical conservatorship over my person and my estate. Attached to the petition were 3 separate psychiatric evaluations. I read the words printed on the stark white paper. Severe cognitive decline. Advanced paranoia. Immediate physical danger to himself and others. The reports were signed by doctors I had never met in my entire life. They had painted a picture of a hollow, babbling old man who could not be trusted to tie his own shoes, let alone manage a real estate empire. If a judge signs this order, Patricia gains absolute, unmitigated control over your physical body and every single bank account you possess, Timothy explained, leaning forward. She can force you into a locked psychiatric facility against your will, and she can liquidate your entire portfolio directly into your son holding company. And because Douglas is your current wealth manager, he is uniquely positioned to validate their claims of your financial incompetence to the court. They have boxed you into a legal corner. My chest tightened, but I refused to let panic take the wheel. Anger is a useless emotion if it does not fuel action. I placed the documents back on the desk and looked Timothy dead in the eye. "I built this empire with calloused hands and 70-hour work weeks," I said, my voice cold and steady. "I will burn it to the ash before I let them spend a single dime of my money." Timothy sat back, waiting for my instruction. "I need you to bypass Douglas completely," I ordered. "Do not touch the liquid assets he is currently managing. It will set off his internal alarms immediately. Instead, I want you to liquidate the physical commercial real estate portfolio. The shopping centers, the downtown office buildings, the suburban warehouses. Every single piece of dirt that has my signature on the deed. I want it sold." Timothy blinked, clearly stunned by the magnitude of the request. "Harold, you are talking about unwinding a lifetime of investments. We would have to sell to cash buyers only to bypass bank underwriting. You will take a severe hit on the market value. I do not care if we sell it for 80 cents on the dollar," I fired back. "Find the cash buyers. I know they are out there hungry for prime commercial real estate. Draft the sale agreements, execute the transfers, and convert my entire physical empire into pure, untraceable cash. Once the funds clear, you will wire every last cent into an irrevocable independent offshore trust in the Cayman Islands. A trust that only I control, and one that is entirely immune to any domestic conservatorship order Patricia tries to enforce. Timothy stared at me, the gears in his brilliant legal mind turning at breakneck speed. It was the nuclear option. If Patricia managed to get the conservatorship approved, she would open my financial vault only to find cobwebs and dust. Nicholas would be left with a worthless, unfunded shell of a startup company, and Douglas would be criminally exposed. "I can do it," Timothy finally said, pulling a fresh legal pad toward him. "But executing off-market commercial sales of this magnitude quietly and without triggering any municipal red flags takes time. I need exactly 7 days to finalize the transactions and route the capital offshore." 7 days. 168 hours. If Patricia or Douglas even catch a whisper that you are moving assets. Timothy warned, his tone dead serious. They will rush an emergency injunction to a friendly judge. They will freeze your accounts instantly and have police drag you to a psychiatric ward that very same night. You have to keep them completely in the dark, Harold. They need to believe their plan is working perfectly. The reality of the situation crashed over me like a tidal wave of ice water. Refusing the poisoned pills was no longer enough. Avoiding my wife was no longer an option. If I acted too healthy, too sharp, or too suspicious, they would panic and accelerate the court order. I could not just survive in that house for the next week. I had to perform. I realized exactly what I had to do. I had to become the very thing they were trying to invent. I had to become the broken, senile, rotting old man from those fake medical reports. I had to give Patricia the twisted satisfaction of watching my mind unravel right in front of her eyes. It was the only way to keep them comfortable. The only way to keep them arrogant. The only way to buy Timothy the 7 days he needed to dismantle their financial future. I stood up from the leather chair, buttoning my suit jacket. "Start making the calls, Timothy. You have 7 days to turn my empire into ghost money." I walked out of the law office and stepped into the blistering afternoon heat. The rules of engagement had completely changed. I drove my truck back toward the sprawling suburban estate that now felt like a prison. As I pulled into the driveway, I saw Patricia's car parked out front. My hands gripped the steering wheel. I took a deep breath, burying the sharp, capable contractor deep inside my chest, and pulled the mask of a crumbling old man over my face. The curtain was going up, and if I missed a single cue, it would cost me my freedom and my life. I stepped out of the truck and intentionally left the driver's side door wide open. I threw my keys into the pristine flower bed Patricia spent thousands of dollars maintaining. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I forced my posture to slump. I dragged my feet across the cobblestone walkway, making my steps heavy and uncoordinated. I pushed the front door open, leaving it ajar behind me. Patricia appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a linen towel. The annoyance on her face was immediate when she saw the open door, but as her eyes locked onto me, her expression shifted. I stood in the foyer, staring blankly at the wall, my mouth hanging slightly open. I let a look of absolute terrified confusion wash over my features. "Patricia," I whispered, making my voice tremble and crack. "Patricia, I cannot find my truck. I went to the store, but I do not know how I got back here. Where is my truck?" She stared at me for a long, agonizing moment. I saw the calculation in her eyes. I saw her scanning my slumped shoulders, my vacant stare. Then a slow, sickening smile spread across her lips. The poison was supposedly working. The predator believed her prey was finally crippled. "Oh, Harold," she cooed, stepping forward and taking my arm with a grip that bruised my skin. "You drove home, sweetheart. You are just having another one of your bad episodes. Let us get you to the sofa. You really are losing your grip, are you not?" She guided me into the living room, treating me like a toddler. Every instinct in my body screamed to throw her off me, to confront her, to demand answers. but I swallowed the bile rising in my throat and let her lead me. I mumbled nonsensically about missing blueprints and old construction sites. The humiliation was acidic, burning my pride from the inside out. But as she turned away to grab me a glass of water, likely laced with another dose of her poison, my eyes focused with razor-sharp clarity. She thought she was leading a dying man to his grave. She had no idea she was actually digging her own. 7 days. The countdown had officially begun. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, staring at the overflowing sink. The cold water spilled over the edge of the granite countertops, cascading down the oak cabinets and pooling around my leather slippers. I did not reach for the handle to turn it off. Instead, I opened the upper cabinets and began pulling out the expensive ceramic plates Patricia loved so much. I let them slip from my fingers, one after another, watching them crash and shatter into jagged pieces on the hardwood floor. The sharp, violent sound of breaking pottery echoed through the sprawling house. I needed to make a scene loud enough to solidify their absolute confidence in my mental destruction. Footsteps pounded down the hallway. Patricia burst into the kitchen, followed closely by Nicholas, who had stopped by for his weekly Sunday visit to check on the progress of his inheritance. Patricia gasped loudly, throwing her hands over her mouth. She played the role of the devastated, overwhelmed wife with Oscar-winning precision. "Oh, Harold, what are you doing?" she cried out, rushing forward to aggressively twist the faucet shut. I slumped against the kitchen island, clutching my head and forcing my hands to tremble violently. "I cannot find the blueprints," I muttered, staring vacantly at the wall and intentionally slurring my words. "I told Arthur we needed to pour the concrete today, before the storm hits, but the blueprints are gone." Arthur was my old construction foreman. He passed away 15 years ago from lung cancer. Nicholas stepped forward, his expensive leather shoes crunching over the broken ceramics. He put a heavy, patronizing hand on my shoulder. "It is all right, Dad," he said smoothly, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Arthur is not here. You are just confused again. Let us get you out of this mess and into bed." As Nicholas guided me down the hallway, I let my dead weight sag against him, playing the helpless, pathetic burden to perfection. We passed the large living room windows, just as Mrs. Gable, our notoriously nosy next-door neighbor, was walking her golden retriever on the sidewalk. She peered through the glass, her eyes wide with curiosity. Patricia immediately went to work. She stepped out onto the front porch, putting on a theatrical display of wiping away fake tears and shaking her head tragically. I could hear her muffled voice through the glass telling the neighbor how hard it was getting, how fast my mind was slipping away, and how she was just doing her best to care for her ailing husband. But the moment Patricia stepped back inside, and we turned the corner into the darkened hallway away from prying eyes, the elaborate illusion instantly dropped. I caught their reflection in the antique mirror hanging on the wall. Nicholas looked at his mother and flashed a wide, predatory grin. Patricia smirked back, giving him a subtle, triumphant nod. They thought the poisoned pills were completely obliterating my brain tissue. They genuinely believed their horrific plan was working flawlessly. They dragged me into my bedroom, pulled the heavy duvet up to my chest, and shut the oak door behind them with a firm click. The moment the latch secured, my trembling stopped completely. I opened my eyes in the darkness, my mind razor-sharp and burning with a cold, calculated rage. Nicholas thought he was a mastermind. He strutted around town as the CEO of a tech startup, driving a leased sports car and wearing custom Italian suits to impress his country club friends. But I knew the absolute truth about my son. His company was a hollow shell bleeding cash for the past 2 years. He had 0 viable products, just a shiny downtown office and a team of overpaid executives draining his accounts. His entire business model currently relied on securing a massive commercial loan by the end of the week. The only way the bank was underwriting that massive loan was by allowing Nicholas to use my prime downtown commercial lot as collateral. He had already forged my signature on the preliminary paperwork, blindly banking on the fact that he would have my legal power of attorney secured before the bank final audit. He was building his entire fraudulent castle on my dirt. Selling that land meant pulling the life support plug right out of his company wall. For the past 6 days, I had played the role of a rotting old man perfectly. The psychological toll of pretending to lose your dignity in front of your abusers was heavy, but it was necessary. I put my shoes in the refrigerator. I wandered into the backyard in the middle of the night, wearing only my pajamas. I called Patricia by my first wife name just to watch her flinch. Every erratic behavior, every shattered plate, every confused mumble bought my lawyer Timothy another 24 hours to execute the off-market sales. I lay in bed listening to the muffled sound of Patricia and Nicholas laughing in the kitchen below, probably toasting to my impending institutionalization. Suddenly, my burner phone, hidden deep inside a slit I had cut into the lining of my mattress, vibrated once against my ribs. I slipped the device out and illuminated the screen under the heavy blankets. It was a secure, encrypted text message from Timothy. "The final commercial transfer is officially approved by the court," the message read. "The buyer wired the cash. The funds have been successfully routed to the Cayman Island Trust. The physical properties are completely gone. You own absolutely nothing on paper." I stared at the glowing letters in the pitch-black room. 0 hour had finally arrived. I smiled a genuine, terrifying smile that no one was there to see. Nicholas thought he was walking into the bank on Monday morning to leverage a multi-million-dollar piece of real estate. He had absolutely no idea that the ground beneath his feet had literally been sold out from under him. The land transfer order was approved. The financial bomb was armed, the timer was set to 0, and my greedy, arrogant son was standing right on the detonator. All I had to do now was sit back and watch the explosion tear his world apart. That evening, the atmosphere inside my own home felt entirely alien. The air was thick with their unchecked arrogance. I was supposed to be fast asleep, locked safely inside my bedroom, heavily sedated by the poisoned pills they firmly believed I had swallowed. Instead, I was sitting perfectly still in the absolute darkness of my room, staring intensely at the glowing screen of my tablet. Earlier that afternoon, while Patricia was away getting her hair styled, and Nicholas was supposedly managing his fake company, I had crept into the formal dining room. Moving with a silent agility they thought I no longer possessed, I carefully unscrewed the ornate ventilation grate positioned directly above the mahogany dining table. I installed a high-definition wireless security camera, wrapping the tiny lens perfectly within the shadows of the ironwork. It was a flawless vantage point. Now I was using it to watch my own family celebrate my impending burial. Patricia walked into the frame carrying a bottle of vintage champagne. I recognized the gold label immediately. It was a rare bottle I had purchased years ago to celebrate our 20th wedding anniversary, a bottle she insisted we save for a truly special occasion. Watching her pop the cork tonight felt like a final vicious knife twist. Douglas was sitting at the head of my table pouring the drinks with the relaxed confidence of a man who believed he already owned my house. Nicholas was leaning back in his chair, his feet resting carelessly on the expensive wood. Samantha was laughing loudly, holding her crystal glass out for a refill. They were the picture of a perfectly happy family, utterly devoid of a single ounce of guilt. I turned the volume up on my tablet. Douglas raised his glass high and announced that his lawyer had just called with fantastic news. He told the table that the judge had reviewed the forged medical evaluations and was fully prepared to sign the emergency conservatorship order by Monday morning. Patricia let out a squeal of sheer delight, leaning over to kiss Douglas passionately right in front of my son. Nicholas did not even blink at the sight of his mother kissing another man. He just rubbed his hands together and bragged that his commercial loan was completely finalized. He boasted to his new wife that all he had to do was walk into the bank tomorrow morning, sign the final collateral agreements using my prime downtown property, and his startup would be flushed with $5 million in pure cash. They clinked their glasses together in a sickening symphony of greed. They toasted to their brilliant future. They toasted to my new miserable life in a locked psychiatric ward. I sat in the darkness of my bedroom watching the glowing screen, feeling absolutely nothing for them anymore. Any lingering trace of paternal love or marital devotion had been entirely eradicated, burned away by the acid of their betrayal. They were just parasites dancing blindly on a trapdoor. And I was the one holding the lever. The sun rose the next morning, bringing the dawn of their destruction. I stayed in bed, playing the heavily sedated, crumbling old man, when Patricia peeked her head through the doorway to check on me. She noted my vacant stare and closed the door with a satisfied hum. I waited until I heard her walk down to the laundry room. Moving quickly, I slipped out of bed and crept down the hallway into my private study. Nicholas had stopped by the house to pick up his custom leather briefcase, the one he had carelessly left on my leather sofa the night before. What my arrogant son did not know was that during those brief, quiet moments, I slipped a tiny voice-activated audio transmitter deep into the lining of the briefcase side pocket. I wanted a front-row seat to his absolute downfall. I hurried back to my room, pulled out my secure phone, connected my wireless earbuds, and activated the live audio feed. I heard the engine of his leased sports car roar to life. I heard the radio playing loud, triumphant music as he drove through the city. I tracked his movements perfectly through the crisp audio feed. 20 minutes later, the ambient noise shifted dramatically. I heard the heavy glass doors of the bank sliding open, the echo of the marble lobby, and the polite greetings of the tellers. My heart beat with a slow, steady rhythm. The predator was walking directly into the cage. Nicholas strode into the executive suite of his loan officer, a senior corporate banker named Mr. Campbell. I listened closely as Nicholas slapped his heavy leather briefcase onto the glass desk, his voice dripping with unbearable condescension. He demanded that Campbell bring out the final paperwork immediately so they could get the $5 million wire transfer initiated before lunch. He loudly bragged that he had a celebratory golf game booked at noon and did not want to be kept waiting by slow bank clerks. Through the audio feed, I heard the sharp clicking of a computer keyboard. There was a long, excruciating silence that stretched out for nearly a full minute. Then Mr. Campbell cleared his throat. His voice did not carry the usual subservient, respectful tone reserved for wealthy corporate clients. It was tight, uncomfortable, and laced with absolute devastating pity. Campbell politely informed Nicholas that there was a catastrophic issue with the collateral file. Nicholas scoffed loudly, asking if it was just a minor paperwork delay regarding the conservatorship. He arrogantly stated that his mother would have full legal control over my estate by Monday morning, so the bank had absolutely nothing to worry about regarding my mental state. But Campbell stopped him right there. He said the conservatorship no longer mattered. Taking a deep breath, Campbell delivered the fatal blow. He informed my son that the prime downtown commercial lot he was attempting to leverage was no longer available for any financial transactions. Nicholas let out a confused, nervous laugh and demanded to know what he meant. Campbell explained with brutal professional clarity that as of yesterday afternoon, the property ownership had legally changed hands. The title had been officially transferred, cleared, and permanently recorded by the county clerk. My name was completely wiped from the deed. The land now belonged entirely to an anonymous offshore holding company based in the Cayman Islands. I sat in my quiet bedroom, gripping the edge of my mattress as I listened to my son's world violently collapse. Nicholas started breathing heavily. His voice cracked as he yelled at the banker to check the system again, claiming it was a technical error, claiming it was completely impossible because I was too mentally broken to sign any complex legal documents. Campbell maintained his professional, pitying tone. He calmly told Nicholas that the signatures were completely verified by a federal notary. The transfer was absolute, and without that specific commercial collateral, the $5 million loan was instantly and permanently denied. Nicholas began to panic. I could hear the sheer terror vibrating in his throat. He stammered frantically, begging Campbell to approve a smaller loan, offering his own house, offering his leased cars, pleading for just enough cash to make his upcoming payroll. But Campbell cut him off, stating that the bank had just run a hard emergency check on his startup company accounts. They saw the massive hidden debts. They saw the bleeding payroll and the outstanding vendor invoices. With a cold finality, Campbell formally asked Nicholas to leave the office, stating that the bank would be officially calling in his existing credit lines by the end of the week, due to extreme financial insolvency. I heard the sound of Nicholas stumbling backward, his heavy leather briefcase hitting the floor with a loud thud. I heard his ragged, desperate breathing as he scrambled to pick it up and ran frantically out of the bank. I pulled the earbuds out, the total silence of my bedroom feeling like a warm, comforting embrace. The very first domino had officially fallen, and it had completely crushed my arrogant son right into the dirt. He was going to speed back to the house to unleash his fury on his mother, and I was going to sit back and watch the glorious explosion. I sat in the heavy leather armchair of my private study, the very room where I had spent countless late nights building the foundations of my business decades ago. The tablet rested on my lap, streaming the live, high-definition video feed from the hidden camera I had painstakingly installed in the dining room ceiling. I poured myself a single glass of aged bourbon, the good stuff I used to save for celebrating closed contracts and massive acquisitions. The house was dead quiet, but the silence was heavy, vibrating, with the sheer electric anticipation of the storm I knew was racing toward our front door. Through the thick, double-paned window, I heard the violent, high-pitched screech of tires tearing across the pristine driveway I had paved with my own hands. A car door slammed so hard it echoed through the oak floors of the sprawling house. Nicholas was home. He did not bother turning the brass handle smoothly. He kicked the front door open, the heavy wood crashing against the drywall and cracking the plaster. His footsteps thundered down the hallway like a wild animal, cornered and completely desperate. Patricia rushed out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on a linen towel, a deep scowl forming on her perfectly made-up face. She started to scold him for the noise, treating him like a petulant child, but the words died instantly in her throat. Through the camera feed, I watched my son march into the formal dining room. His custom-tailored designer suit jacket was hanging off one shoulder. His silk tie ripped loose, his face a terrifying shade of crimson. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving with deep, ragged breaths. He grabbed the back of one of the expensive mahogany dining chairs and hurled it across the room with all his might. It shattered against the antique crystal display cabinet, sending shards of glass and shattered heirloom porcelain raining down onto the Persian rug. Patricia screamed, jumping back and demanding to know what he was doing, demanding to know why he was destroying her beautiful house. Nicholas spun around, his eyes wide, bloodshot, and bulging with a terrifying realization. "The land is gone," he roared, his voice cracking under the immense weight of his own panic. "It is all gone. Every single square foot of the downtown commercial lot. It was transferred yesterday afternoon to some anonymous offshore holding company based in the Cayman Islands. My name is completely wiped from the county records." Patricia froze, the blood completely draining from her face. She looked like a ghost. She stammered, shaking her head aggressively, insisting that it was completely impossible. She practically yelled that I was upstairs in my bedroom, heavily medicated, that my brain was turning to mush, just like Douglas had promised, and that I was incapable of signing my own name, let alone executing a multi-million-dollar international real estate transaction. Nicholas let out a manic laugh that sounded more like a dry heave. "He is not medicated, you fool. He played us. He played all of us. He knew exactly what we were doing. The bank denied the $5 million loan. They pulled my entire credit line. They looked at my internal audits and flagged me for extreme financial insolvency. Do you understand what this means? My company is dead. I have an entire building of executives expecting payroll on Friday, and I do not have a single dime to my name. I will be bankrupt by tomorrow morning, and the federal investigators will be looking into my fraudulent ledgers by the afternoon." He grabbed a priceless porcelain vase from the center of the table and smashed it directly into the floor, screaming into the empty air. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my bourbon, letting the smooth, fiery burn coat my throat. Watching my arrogant son completely unravel, watching the absolute terror wash over the woman who had coldly planned to bury me alive in a psychiatric ward was utterly intoxicating. I felt no pity for them. I felt no sorrow for the destruction of the life I had provided. A seasoned builder knows that when you construct a house on a rotten foundation, the collapse is not a tragedy, it is an inevitability. I was simply the one who pulled out the primary supporting beam. Patricia's hands were shaking so violently she could barely unlock her phone screen. She hit the speaker button with a trembling finger and dialed Douglas. It rang twice before he picked up, his voice smooth, slick, and confident as always, asking if she was ready for their afternoon rendezvous at the hotel. "Shut up and listen to me," Patricia hissed, her manicured nails digging deep into the edge of the dining table, as if she were trying to keep herself from falling over. Harold moved the properties. He sold the downtown lot. He sold all the commercial warehouses. Nicholas just got rejected at the bank because the collateral does not exist anymore. How could you not know about this? You are his wealth manager. How could you let this happen right under your nose? The dead silence on the other end of the line was absolute music to my ears. I could practically hear the gears grinding to a violent halt in Douglas' head. His smooth, arrogant facade instantly shattered. He asked Patricia to repeat herself, his voice dropping into a tight, panicked whisper. He muttered that it was impossible, that the accounts he monitored showed absolutely no unusual activity. But I had used Timothy to bypass him, entirely utilizing private legal channels that left the slick financial advisor completely in the dark. Nicholas grabbed the phone from his mother's hand, screaming directly into the speaker. He demanded that Douglas pull whatever strings he had, to freeze my remaining accounts, to file a legal motion to reverse the sale, to forge whatever documents he needed to save his sinking company. Nicholas was crying now, begging the man who was sleeping with his mothers to somehow fix the colossal disaster. But Douglas was a financial parasite, and parasites know exactly when to abandon a dying host. Through the crisp audio feed, I heard the rapid, erratic clicking of a keyboard in the background on Douglas' end. He was already sitting at his computer. Douglas told them to calm down, forcing a tone of false reassurance. He promised he would immediately file an emergency injunction with a friendly judge to lock down my remaining liquid assets before I could move them too. He swore to Patricia that he would handle the legal fallout, telling her to just keep me distracted, to force more pills down my throat, and to keep me confined to the house so I could not contact anyone else. Then he abruptly hung up the phone without another word. Patricia let out a shaky breath, leaning against the wall and telling Nicholas that Douglas would fix it. She desperately tried to convince my son that they just needed to stick to the plan, drag me to a psychiatrist tomorrow morning, and force the medical conservatorship through to claim whatever cash was left in the domestic accounts. She was clinging to a fantasy that had already burned to the ground. As I sat in the dim light of my study, staring at the frozen screen of my tablet, I smiled a deep, genuine smile. I knew Douglas far better than they did. He was a coward who operated entirely in the shadows. He was not filing any legal injunctions. He was not calling any judges. He had just realized that I was completely lucid, that I possessed the mental capacity to execute complex offshore transfers, which meant I likely knew everything about his affair and his criminal conspiracy. His legal exposure was absolute. Douglas was not trying to save Patricia or Nicholas. At that very moment, he was frantically logging into the joint illicit offshore accounts he shared with my wife, preparing to drain every single stolen dollar so they had hidden away over the past 5 years. He was going to liquidate the stolen funds, transfer them to a ghost account, pack a bag, and cut all ties before the police inevitably showed up at his door. The ship was rapidly sinking, the rats were viciously turning on each other, and the bloodbath was just beginning. And I was going to make sure none of them made it to the lifeboats. I remained in the absolute silence of my study, watching the live video feed on my tablet. The dining room below was a battlefield of shattered porcelain and shattered egos. Nicholas was on his knees, surrounded by the broken pieces of the antique vase he had just violently destroyed. He was pulling at his hair, breathing in heavy, ragged gasps that sounded exactly like a dying animal. Patricia stood frozen against the floral wallpaper, her face completely devoid of color. The reality of their absolute financial ruin was suffocating them both. I took another slow, deliberate sip of my aged bourbon, feeling a deep, profound satisfaction settle into my bones. But the bloodbath within these walls was far from over. Heavy, aggressive footsteps clicked rapidly against the hardwood floor of the main hallway. Samantha burst into the formal dining room, her arms laden with expensive shopping bags from high-end designer boutiques. She had clearly spent the entire morning maxing out the very last of Nicholas' available credit lines, purchasing silk dresses and imported leather shoes. She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw the complete destruction of the room. She dropped the luxury bags, letting the expensive items spill carelessly onto the floor. She demanded to know what was going on and why her husband was crying on the floor like a pathetic, helpless child. Nicholas looked up at his new wife, his eyes red and swollen with panic. He tried to speak, but his voice broke under the immense weight of his failure. He finally choked out the miserable words, telling her that the bank had officially denied the massive commercial loan. He told her that my prime downtown property had been legally sold to a ghost company in the Cayman Islands, and that his heavily leveraged tech startup was officially and completely bankrupt. He reached a trembling hand toward her, begging for comfort, begging her to tell him that they would figure it out together as a married couple. I watched the screen closely, expecting the young bride to fall to her knees and hold her devastated husband. I expected some display of the marital devotion they had bragged about. Instead, Samantha stood perfectly still. The mask of the sweet, supportive daughter-in-law melted away in a single devastating second. Her perfectly contoured face hardened into a mask of pure, absolute disgust. She looked down at Nicholas not with pity or love, but with the cold, calculating stare of a ruthless auditor looking at a worthless, depreciating asset. "You are completely bankrupt," she said, her voice dropping into a flat, terrifying monotone that echoed in the quiet room. "You have absolutely nothing left." Nicholas stammered, nodding his head frantically. He begged her to stay calm, claiming he could pivot the business model, claiming he could find another private investor to save their luxurious lifestyle. But Samantha was already moving. She turned on her expensive high heels and marched directly toward the grand staircase. Nicholas scrambled to his feet, chasing after her like a desperate, starving stray dog. Through the sensitive audio feed I had planted deep inside his leather briefcase, I heard their footsteps pounding up the wooden stairs and into the large guest bedroom they were currently using. I switched the video feed on my tablet to the hidden security camera I had installed in the upper hallway right outside their bedroom door. The audio was crystal clear. Samantha was aggressively throwing her expensive designer dresses and luxury cosmetics into her leather suitcases with frantic, chaotic energy. Nicholas stood in the doorway, pleading with her, begging her to stop packing. He reminded her that they had just stood at the altar and promised to be together for richer or poorer. Samantha let out a harsh, cruel laugh that echoed violently down the long hallway. She zipped up her first heavy suitcase and turned to face him, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at his chest. "I did not marry a bankrupt loser," she screamed, her voice vibrating with pure, unadulterated venom. "I married the sole heir to a massive real estate empire. You promised me private jets and expensive winter homes in Aspen. You swore to me that your senile father was going to sign over his entire fortune by the end of the month. I am not spending the best years of my youth dodging angry debt collectors and living in a tiny rented apartment with an incompetent fool who cannot even secure a simple commercial bank loan." The brutality of her words hung heavy in the stale air. I sat in my quiet study feeling a grim sense of ultimate validation. Years ago, when Nicholas first brought Samantha home to this very house, I had warned him. I pulled him aside and told him she had the cold, calculating eyes of a financial parasite. I told him she was only interested in my massive bank accounts and his direct access to them. But my arrogant son had completely ignored my paternal warnings. He called me a bitter old man who simply did not understand modern romance. He had actively and willingly thrown away a father who had worked 70-hour weeks to build a legacy for him, all to serve a blind devotion to a woman who treated him like a walking automatic teller machine. And now the machine was completely empty, and the greedy parasite was aggressively detaching herself to find a new, wealthy host. Nicholas fell to his knees in the doorway, begging her not to leave him alone in this disaster. He was utterly pathetic, stripped of all his arrogant corporate bravado. He sobbed openly, grabbing the edge of her heavy suitcase to stop her from leaving. But Samantha violently kicked his hand away with the sharp point of her designer heel. She told him she was calling her ruthless divorce lawyer the very moment she got to a luxury downtown hotel to draft the separation papers immediately. She grabbed her heavy bags, stepped right over her weeping, devastated husband, and marched down the hallway without a single backward glance or ounce of regret. A few moments later, I heard the heavy front oak door slam shut, followed by the loud roar of her sports car engine speeding aggressively away down the paved driveway. Nicholas remained on the floor of the hallway, crying uncontrollably into his hands. He had lost his fake company, his future fortune, and his deceitful wife in the span of 3 short hours. He had blindly traded genuine paternal love for a woman who saw him entirely as a financial stepping stone. The isolation he was experiencing must have been absolute psychological torture, but I felt absolutely no sympathy for the ungrateful boy who had coldly conspired to lock me in a psychiatric ward for the rest of my natural life. Patricia slowly walked up the carpeted stairs, stepping carefully around her broken, sobbing son. She did not offer him a warm hug. She did not offer him a single word of maternal comfort or reassurance. She simply stood over him, her face twisted with a new frantic, dangerous desperation. She told Nicholas to get up off the floor and stop crying like a weak child. She said they had a much bigger catastrophic problem than a runaway gold-digging bride. Through the crisp audio feed, I heard Patricia whispering in a tight, panicked, breathless voice. She said Douglas had completely stopped answering his phone. She said the illicit bank accounts they shared were entirely frozen, and she suspected her slick lover had taken the stolen cash and run away like a coward. The walls were rapidly closing in on their criminal conspiracy. Patricia paced the hallway, biting her nails nervously. She told Nicholas that they absolutely could not wait until Monday morning for the judge to approve the medical conservatorship. She said, if I truly had the hidden mental capacity to move the commercial real estate, I might wake up tomorrow and wire the remaining domestic cash entirely out of their reach. We cannot wait, she hissed, her voice vibrating with pure, desperate malice. He is playing us, Nicholas. Your father is completely awake and he is systematically dismantling our lives. We have to take him out of this house tonight. Nicholas wiped his wet face, sniffing loudly. He asked his mother what she meant, pointing out that they did not have the legal paperwork yet to force me into the psychiatric facility. Patricia leaned in very close, her voice dropping to a dangerous, sinister whisper. She said she knew a violent man from the old neighborhood, a man who handled discreet, illegal problems for desperate, wealthy clients. She said she was going to pay him the last of her hidden emergency cash to bring 2 large thugs to the house tonight. They would pose as emergency medical workers. They would drug me heavily, strap me to a tight stretcher, and drag me out of the house in the dead of the night. She said she had already forged an emergency commitment order and that the corrupt director of a private asylum on the edge of the city was waiting to lock me in a padded room and throw away the key for a generous fee. I sat perfectly still in the leather armchair of my quiet study. The shadows in the room suddenly felt much colder and far more dangerous. The game had just rapidly escalated from a white-collar financial crime to immediate violent physical danger. They were cornered, desperate animals, and they were preparing to use brute force to silence me forever. The countdown timer was no longer ticking down to Monday morning. The timer was ticking down to midnight tonight. I slowly closed my glowing laptop and stood up. I had successfully dismantled their financial future, but now I had to fight a physical war for my actual survival. I walked over to my heavy oak desk and opened the bottom drawer, pulling out the heavy iron wrench I kept for emergencies. The final violent battle was coming directly to my bedroom door, and I was going to be completely ready for them. The heavy iron wrench was a comforting weight in my hand, but it was not enough for what was coming through my front door. I placed it back on the heavy oak desk and walked quietly toward the walk-in closet at the far end of my master bedroom. Hidden behind a false panel in the back wall was a biometric safe Patricia knew absolutely nothing about. I pressed my thumb against the cold glass scanner, and the heavy steel door clicked open with a soft mechanical hum. Inside rested my vintage pump-action 12-gauge shotgun. I had not fired it in over a decade, but I maintained it meticulously, oiling the barrel and checking the mechanisms every single year. I pulled the heavy weapon out and loaded 2 thick buckshot shells directly into the chamber. The metallic clack of the pump action sliding into place was the loudest sound in the dark, silent house. I walked back to the center of the room and sat on the edge of the mattress, waiting in the pitch-black shadows. My breathing was slow and measured. The crumbling old man was completely gone, replaced entirely by the ruthless contractor who used to break strikes and intimidate union bosses back in the 70s. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight. Exactly 12 minutes later, I heard the faint, agonizing creak of the back patio door being forced open. They were trying to be quiet, but the sprawling house was my creation. I knew the sound of every single floorboard. 2 sets of heavy boots stepped onto the hardwood floor of the kitchen, moving with a slow, deliberate rhythm toward the main staircase. Patricia had likely left the security system completely deactivated and provided them with a clear map of the house layout. I sat perfectly still, resting the heavy wooden stock of the shotgun against my shoulder. The footsteps moved up the carpeted stairs, muting their heavy tread. They paused right outside my bedroom door. I could hear them whispering to each other in gruff, guttural tones. The brass doorknob turned slowly, but I had locked the heavy deadbolt from the inside. There was a brief pause followed by a sudden, violent crash. The heavy oak door splintered and flew open, crashing loudly against the interior drywall. 2 massive men stepped into the pitch-black bedroom. They were built like brick walls, wearing dark clothing and heavy leather gloves. The man in the front was holding a thick medical syringe filled with a cloudy, viscous liquid perfectly illuminated by the pale moonlight filtering through the large window. They expected to find a heavily sedated, helpless old man tangled in his bedsheets, ready to be dragged away into the night. Instead, they found me sitting perfectly upright in the darkness, the cold steel barrel of my 12-gauge shotgun pointed directly at the center of the lead intruder chest. I turned on the small tactical flashlight mounted to the barrel, blinding them instantly with a brilliant beam of harsh white light. "Drop the needle," I ordered, my voice echoing through the dark room with absolute, terrifying authority. The 2 massive men froze, completely paralyzed by the sudden blinding light and the undeniable threat of the heavy firearm. The man in front squinted through the glare, his eyes wide with sheer panic as he realized the pathetic, senile target he was hired to kidnap was actually a lethal predator waiting in ambush. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his grip tightening on the plastic syringe. I racked the slide of the shotgun, the heavy metallic sound echoing violently in the quiet room. "I told you to drop it," I repeated, my finger resting heavily on the cold metal trigger. "I will blow a hole through your chest so big, the police will not even need an autopsy." The thick plastic syringe slipped from his trembling, gloved fingers and bounced harmlessly onto the plush carpet. "Kick it away and get on your knees," I commanded, keeping the blinding light focused directly on their faces. Both men immediately dropped heavily to their knees, raising their large hands high into the air. They were hired thugs, accustomed to intimidating terrified victims, not facing a man who was entirely prepared to kill them. I stood up slowly, keeping the heavy shotgun perfectly leveled at them. I pulled my secure phone from my pocket with my free hand and activated the voice recorder, dropping it onto the nightstand right next to them. I wanted their full confession, and I wanted it completely documented. "You have exactly 10 seconds to tell me exactly who paid you to break into my house," I said, my voice dropping into a cold, mechanical monotone. "If you lie to me, or if you hesitate, I am going to shoot the man on the left in the knee, and then I will ask the man on the right the exact same question." The thug on the left swallowed hard sweat forming rapidly on his forehead, despite the cool air conditioning. "It was the woman," he stammered, his voice shaking with absolute terror. The blonde woman who lives here. Patricia. She paid us $10,000 in pure cash. She said you were completely out of your mind, and that we just needed to sedate you and drive you to a private psychiatric clinic on the edge of the county boundary. She gave us the medical paperwork and the entry codes. And who else, I demanded, stepping one pace closer, pressing the cold steel barrel directly against his sweaty forehead. I know she did not set this up entirely by herself. She does not have the connections to find street garbage like you. The second thug, the one who had been carrying the heavy syringe, spoke up, his voice trembling violently. It was a guy named Douglas, he choked out, refusing to look at the blinding light. A slick guy in a fancy suit. He is the one who actually contacted our boss. He handed over the cash in a brown paper bag behind a downtown hotel 3 hours ago. He told us we had to get you out of the house tonight because you were moving his money and ruining his entire financial setup. Douglas and Patricia. They had officially crossed the line from white-collar fraud to attempted violent kidnapping. They had handed me the absolute perfect weapon to destroy their entire lives and lock them in a federal prison for the next 20 years. The voice recorder on the nightstand captured every single word of their terrified, desperate confession. I reached over and tapped the screen, saving the audio file directly to my encrypted offshore cloud server. The physical threat was completely neutralized, and the legal trap was now perfectly set. I kept the heavy shotgun leveled at their heads and ordered them to lie flat on their stomachs with their hands strictly behind their backs. I kicked their heavy boots apart and moved cautiously toward my closet, keeping my eyes locked on them. I pulled out a thick bundle of heavy-duty industrial zip ties I had purchased years ago for securing commercial construction fencing. They were thick plastic bands designed to hold thousands of pounds of sheer pressure. I bound their wrists tightly together, pulling the heavy plastic until it bit deeply into their skin. I bound their ankles with equal ferocity, and then connected their wrists to their ankles, forcing them into a rigid, painful position on the carpet. They grunted in pain, but they did not dare fight back against the cold steel barrel of the shotgun resting right next to my knee. I grabbed 2 rolls of thick silver duct tape from my desk drawer and wrapped it aggressively around their mouths, silencing their terrified whimpers. They were completely immobilized, entirely neutralized, and thoroughly trapped in my bedroom. The digital clock on the nightstand read 2 in the morning. I had approximately 4 hours before the sun would rise and Patricia would wake up to check on the success of her violent kidnapping plot. I dragged the 2 heavy-bound men into my spacious walk-in closet, pushing them deep into the back corner behind my hanging winter coats. I shut the heavy wooden door and locked it firmly from the outside, leaving them in absolute darkness. I walked back into the bedroom and surveyed the damage. The splintered doorframe was impossible to fix, but that played perfectly into my grand strategy. I picked up the plastic syringe full of heavy sedatives from the carpet and slipped it carefully into a plastic evidence bag I had brought from my study. I gathered my secure phone, my tablet, and the encrypted flash drive containing all the financial transfers and the recorded confessions. I packed a small leather duffel bag with a few changes of clothes and a thick stack of emergency cash. The house was no longer a battlefield. It was an active crime scene, and I was officially abandoning the fortress. I walked quietly down the main staircase, avoiding the creaking floorboards with practiced precision. I slipped out the back patio door, the same way the thugs had entered, leaving it slightly ajar. I walked through the cool night air toward my old, restored classic car, parked hidden inside the detached rear garage. I started the engine, the low rumble masking my silent escape, and drove slowly down the dark suburban street, leaving my sprawling estate behind forever. The predator was completely gone, and the trap was perfectly armed. The sun rose, casting a warm golden light across the pristine front lawn of the estate. Patricia woke up in the guest bedroom she had been using ever since she started the poison protocol. She stretched comfortably, her face breaking into a wide, triumphant smile as she looked at the bright morning sky. She genuinely believed her nightmare was officially over. She assumed the violent thugs had successfully broken into the house, dragged my heavily sedated body out the back door, and locked me permanently inside a padded psychiatric cell. She assumed she was now the sole absolute master of my entire commercial empire. She put on a luxurious silk robe and walked down the hallway, her bare feet sinking into the expensive plush carpet. She hummed a cheerful melody as she approached my master bedroom, expecting to find an empty bed and a clear path to the bank. She pushed the broken splintered door open and stepped inside. The room was completely empty. The bedsheets were perfectly undisturbed. She let out a small, delighted laugh, clapping her hands together in sheer joy. She did not bother looking in the closet where the two bound thugs were muffled and suffocating. She did not notice the missing duffel bag or the missing emergency cash. She simply saw an empty room and assumed her violent criminal plan had been executed with absolute, flawless precision. Patricia practically danced down the grand staircase, heading straight for the massive gourmet kitchen. She pulled a fresh bottle of incredibly expensive champagne from the refrigerated wine cooler, popping the cork with a loud, festive bang that echoed through the quiet, empty house. She poured herself a tall, crystal flute of the bubbling golden liquid and raised it high into the morning air, toasting her own brilliant, ruthless success. She believed she had won the war. She believed she had successfully buried her wealthy husband alive and claimed his entire fortune. She had absolutely no idea that the fortune was already sitting securely in the Cayman Islands. She had no idea her son was completely bankrupt and abandoned. She had no idea her slick lover was desperately trying to flee the country with stolen money. And she had absolutely no idea that I was sitting comfortably in a downtown hotel room, handing a secure flash drive full of recorded confessions to a federal prosecutor. Patricia took a long, satisfying sip of the expensive champagne, tasting nothing but pure victory. She was celebrating her absolute triumph, entirely unaware that she was standing completely alone on the deck of a rapidly sinking ship. I sat perfectly still in the leather chair of the private security office located in the back of Oscar Restaurant. The glowing monitors on the wall displayed the live video feed from the VIP dining room. Oscar was widely known as one of the finest and most exclusive culinary establishments in the entire city. It was a place where the wealthy elite came to display their power. What my greedy family absolutely did not know was that 40 years ago I gave Oscar the initial seed money to open his very first diner. I asked for zero equity and zero interest. I simply wanted to see a good, hardworking man succeed. Oscar never forgot that loyalty. When I called him an hour ago and asked for a massive favor, he did not hesitate to give me complete, undisputed control over his private security room. Through the crisp video screen, I watched the four traders aggressively celebrate my supposed demise. Patricia had intentionally booked the most expensive table in the house to mark the occasion. She was wearing a brand new imported silk dress and a heavy diamond necklace that she had likely purchased with the very last of her hidden credit lines. Douglas sat right beside her, acting like the conquering king of my castle. His arm was draped arrogantly over the back of her velvet chair. They were drinking vintage imported champagne that cost upwards of $3,000 a bottle. They laughed loudly and clinked their expensive crystal glasses together, toasting to their absolute flawless victory. Nicholas was sitting across from them. His face was still carrying a slight pale tint from his catastrophic morning at the bank, but a new arrogant smirk had fully returned to his lips. Right next to him sat Samantha. My ruthless, gold-digging daughter-in-law had come rushing back the very second Patricia called her to announce that the midnight kidnapping was a complete success. Samantha was leaning her head affectionately on Nicholas' shoulder, tracing slow circles on his chest, as if she had not completely abandoned him and brutally demanded a divorce just 12 hours earlier. She was back playing the role of the devoted, loving wife, simply because she smelled fresh blood and massive amounts of money in the water. I reached out and turned up the audio feed on the security monitor. Patricia was bragging loudly to the entire table. She described the sheer delight of walking into my master bedroom this morning and finding the bed completely empty and the door frame splintered. She laughed a cold, vicious laugh as she told Douglas that the violent thugs must have dragged my heavily sedated body out of the house with zero complications. She firmly and happily believed that I was currently locked inside a dark, padded cell in a corrupt private asylum, completely stripped of my basic human rights and my dignity. Douglas raised his champagne glass high and proudly announced that his corrupt lawyer would finalize the medical conservatorship by Monday morning. He arrogantly promised Nicholas that the frozen domestic bank accounts would be unlocked immediately, and his failing fraudulent tech startup would be flooded with $5 million in fresh capital. Samantha giggled and kissed Nicholas on the cheek, whispering excitedly about the luxury winter home they were going to buy in Aspen and the private jets they were going to lease. They were aggressively feasting on the carcass of my life, completely unaware that the meat they were consuming was fatally poisoned. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee. The sheer, unchecked audacity of their celebration was almost impressive. They were recklessly spending money they did not actually possess to celebrate a violent kidnapping they did not actually commit. I looked over at Oscar, who was standing quietly beside the glowing monitors. He wore his immaculate white chef coat, his weathered face hardened with pure disgust as he listened to my family speak about me. He had known me for decades, and hearing them plot my institutionalization made his blood boil. I gave him a slow, firm nod. The trap was fully set, the audience was seated, and it was time to spring the final mechanical lever. Oscar turned and picked up a heavy silver serving tray from his oak desk. Resting perfectly in the center of the tray was a specific arrangement of items I had brought with me from the ruined house. Oscar carefully covered the arrangement with a polished, gleaming silver dome, hiding the contents completely from view. He gave me a deep, respectful bow and walked out of the security office, heading straight down the carpeted hallway for the VIP dining room. I leaned closer to the monitor, resting my hands on the desk. Through the screen, I watched the heavy mahogany double doors of the private room swing open. Oscar stepped inside, carrying the silver tray with flawless, professional grace. Patricia stopped her manic laughing immediately and looked at the chef with a highly entitled expression. She demanded to know what he was bringing them, stating aggressively that they had not ordered the next culinary course yet. Oscar placed the heavy silver tray directly in the center of the large table right between Patricia and Douglas. He stood tall and stated in a polite but cold, rigid monotone that this was a very special, complimentary dish from the owner of the establishment. He added that the dish was specifically reserved for celebrations of this unique magnitude. Without waiting for a response or a thank you, he turned around and walked briskly out of the room, shutting the heavy mahogany doors firmly behind him. The four traders stared at the polished silver dome sitting in the center of their table. The reflection of the overhead crystal chandeliers distorted their greedy, anticipating faces. Nicholas rubbed his hands together eagerly and leaned forward, assuming it was some kind of rare, expensive delicacy like imported beluga caviar or shaved white truffles. Samantha smiled greedily, patting his arm and urging him to open it quickly so they could continue their lavish feast. I held my breath in the dark, quiet security office, watching the screen closely, waiting for the exact moment their entire false reality violently shattered into pieces. Nicholas reached out and gripped the ornate brass handle of the dome. He lifted the heavy silver cover in one smooth upward motion, completely revealing the complimentary dish. There was absolutely no gourmet food on the silver tray. There was no expensive caviar or rare meat. Resting silently on a bed of dark crimson velvet was the familiar plastic bottle of vitamin pills. The exact same bottle Patricia had been maliciously using to slowly poison my brain and destroy my nervous system for the past 6 months. Right next to the lethal plastic bottle rested a thick, heavy stack of legally bound papers secured with a bright red wax seal. The reaction around the table was instantaneous and absolutely beautiful to witness. Patricia let out a sharp, strangled gasp that sounded like she was choking on broken glass. All the color instantly drained from her perfectly contoured face, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost. She stared at the plastic bottle of poisoned pills as if it were a live, venomous snake coiled on the table preparing to strike. Her hands began to shake so violently, she dropped her crystal champagne glass, spilling the expensive wine all over the white linen tablecloth. She recognized the bottle immediately, because she was the very person who had secretly hidden it in my bathroom cabinet. Douglas frowned in deep confusion. He did not recognize the plastic pill bottle, but his sharp, predatory financial instincts immediately drew his full attention to the heavy legal documents. He reached across the table and snatched the thick stack of papers, breaking the wax seal. He flipped open the cover page, his eyes frantically scanning the dense legal text. Through the sensitive audio feed, I could hear his breathing suddenly become rapid, erratic, and incredibly shallow. Nicholas demanded to know what the papers were, his voice cracking with a sudden rising panic. He asked Douglas if it was the advanced conservatorship approval from the judge. Douglas dropped the papers onto the unsoiled part of the tablecloth, as if they were physically burning his fingers. He looked at Patricia with a face completely devoid of his usual slick arrogance. He stammered uncontrollably, stating that it was a finalized international transfer ledger. He told the silent, terrified table that every single domestic bank account, every single investment portfolio, and every remaining liquid asset I possessed had been permanently and irrevocably wired to the Cayman Islands Trust. He pointed a shaking finger at the documents, noting that the federal timestamps on the transfer proved they were executed this very morning, while they blindly thought I was locked away in a padded cell. Samantha stood up from her chair in a flash of fury, her heavy chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. She looked down at Nicholas with pure, unfiltered, malicious rage. She realized instantly that there was absolutely no money left to steal. The massive financial empire she had eagerly returned to claim was completely gone. The billionaire inheritance was nothing but empty smoke and shattered mirrors. She had tied herself to a bankrupt loser for absolutely nothing. Patricia grabbed the solid edge of the dining table, desperately trying to keep herself from collapsing onto the floor. She stared at the plastic bottle of poisoned pills, and the horrific, devastating truth finally crashed down on her shoulders. The violent thugs had not kidnapped me in the night. The empty master bedroom did not mean I was defeated or captured. It meant I had successfully turned their violent trap against them. It meant I was completely awake, completely lucid, and entirely aware of every single criminal act they had committed against me. I sat back in the dark, quiet security office, watching them panic like cornered, desperate rats in a rapidly sinking cage. Douglas grabbed his phone frantically, trying to log into his illicit offshore accounts, but I already knew he would find them completely frozen and seized by federal authorities. Nicholas put his head in his hands, sobbing loudly and pathetically, as Samantha aggressively screamed insults at him, calling him a worthless, pathetic failure. Patricia just stared blindly at the silver tray, her mouth opening and closing without making a single sound. They had eagerly gathered to celebrate their absolute victory. They had arrogantly toasted to my tragic demise and recklessly spent thousands of dollars to revel in my destruction. But as the silver dome was lifted, they finally understood the brutal, devastating reality of their situation. They had not defeated the weak old man. Their enemy had not fallen. The predator was still actively hunting, and he had just firmly locked the doors of the slaughterhouse, leaving them trapped inside with absolutely no way out. The heavy mahogany doors of the VIP dining room swung open with a slow, deliberate creak that instantly shattered the suffocating silence inside. The four traitors were still completely frozen around the large table, staring blindly at the plastic bottle of poisoned pills and the offshore transfer documents sitting neatly under the polished silver dome. They slowly turned their heads toward the entrance, likely expecting to see a confused waiter coming to clear their expensive plates. Instead, they saw me. I stepped over the threshold and left the fragile, crumbling old man entirely behind in the dark shadows. I was wearing my custom-tailored charcoal suit, the exact one I always reserved for closing massive corporate acquisitions and hostile takeovers. My posture was perfectly straight, my shoulders were broad, and my steps were measured, heavy, and radiating absolute, undisputed authority. The trembling hands, the slurred speech, and the vacant, pathetic stare were completely gone. I looked directly at my treacherous wife with eyes as cold and sharp as shattered glass. Flanking me on either side like heavily armed palace guards were my brilliant, ruthless lawyer Timothy Dawson and my oldest, most loyal friend Oscar. We formed an impenetrable human wall blocking their only exit from the room. Patricia let out a pathetic, strangled, whimpering sound that died deep in her throat. The expensive crystal champagne flute slipped entirely from her trembling fingers and crashed onto the hardwood floor, shattering into 100 glittering pieces. The expensive vintage wine pooled around her designer shoes, looking exactly like fresh, dark blood. She stared at me as if she were looking at a resurrected ghost walking straight out of an open grave. Her greedy, calculating mind simply could not process the impossible sight of the man she firmly believed was locked away in a dark psychiatric ward standing right before her. Nicholas abruptly stopped his pathetic sobbing and stared at me with his mouth hanging wide open, a look of sheer, unadulterated terror washing over his pale, sweaty face. Samantha slowly backed away from the table, pressing her back firmly against the expensive floral wallpaper, entirely eager to distance herself from the sinking ship she had so foolishly climbed aboard just an hour ago. I stood silently in the doorway, letting their absolute panic wash over my shoulders like a refreshing summer rain. For 45 long, agonizing years, I had intentionally made myself smaller, just to keep the peace inside our sprawling suburban home. I was the man who built a massive commercial empire from the dirt, up working grueling 70-hour weeks, breathing in toxic concrete dust, and managing ruthless union contractors. Yet when I crossed the threshold of my own front door, I always chose to yield. I swallowed my hard-earned pride when Patricia demanded ridiculous, endless allowances for her vain social projects. I completely bit my tongue when Nicholas displayed his lazy, arrogant entitlement instead of learning the fundamental value of hard, honest labor. I constantly compromised my own personal happiness, firmly believing that keeping the family unified under one roof was the ultimate definition of a successful man. I truly thought my endless, silent sacrifices were holding the foundation of our family together. I believed that absorbing their insults, their ungratefulness, and their endless demands was simply the heavy price of being a good father and a devoted husband. But looking at them now cowering like trapped rats in the luxurious VIP room, I realized my blind devotion had only provided a comfortable, warm breeding ground for parasites. They had foolishly mistaken my quiet, endless patience for fundamental weakness. They had mistaken my paternal forgiveness for creeping senility. Tonight, I was officially retracting every single ounce of mercy I had ever extended to them. Over the past 4 decades, the accommodating passive husband and the endlessly forgiving father were permanently dead and buried. I was the king reclaiming his stolen throne, and I was completely prepared to scorch the earth to ensure they never rose again. "Hello, Patricia," I said, my voice dropping into a low, booming baritone that vibrated against the crystal chandeliers and commanded the entire room. "I sincerely hope you are enjoying the complimentary appetizer. I personally selected the vintage for this specific occasion." I took a slow, deliberate step forward, the hardwood floor clicking sharply under my polished leather shoes. "You really should have checked the hidden security cameras before you paid those 2 incompetent street thugs to break into my house. They are currently locked very tightly in my master bedroom closet, bound with industrial plastic zip ties and suffocating in the dark." They sang like absolute canaries, Patricia. They told me exactly how much stolen cash you handed them in that brown paper bag. They told me everything about your little midnight kidnapping plot, and they named Douglas as your direct accomplice. I have every single terrified word completely recorded and saved on a secure, encrypted server. Patricia collapsed back into her velvet dining chair, clutching her chest as if she were having a massive heart attack. She could not formulate a single word. Her throat was entirely paralyzed by the sheer, crushing magnitude of her ultimate failure. Nicholas put his head down on the table, wrapping his arms around his skull, wanting to completely disappear from existence. The false billionaire heir was nothing but a frightened, miserable child, realizing his protective shield had violently morphed into his executioner. Douglas, however, was an entirely different breed of predator. He was a slick, white-collar criminal who survived by manipulating the complex legal system and talking his way out of catastrophic corners. He realized instantly that his illicit offshore accounts were frozen. His disgusting affair was completely exposed, and his entire lucrative financial career was burning rapidly to the ground. But his massive, fragile ego simply refused to let him die quietly on his knees. He stood up from the dining table, his heavy wooden chair scraping loudly and aggressively against the floor. He nervously smoothed the lapels of his expensive Italian suit, trying desperately to project a false aura of professional authority and control. He puffed out his chest and pointed a manicured, trembling finger directly at my face. "You think you are so incredibly smart?" "Harold," he spat, his voice trembling with a toxic mixture of raw panic and forced bravado. "You think you can just walk in here and intimidate us with your little theatrical, dramatic entrance? You are completely out of your mind. I am your legally appointed wealth manager, and Patricia is your lawful wedded wife. The documents sitting on this table are completely fraudulent because you do not possess the mental capacity to execute international wire transfers. You have absolutely no right to trap us in this room like animals. You are actively harassing us, and you are illegally trespassing on a private booked event." Douglas took an aggressive step toward me, likely trying to use his physical height to his advantage. But Oscar immediately stepped forward, crossing his massive arms over his pristine white chef coat, radiating pure physical menace. Timothy Dawson simply smiled, adjusting his glasses and pulling a thick stack of finalized federal warrants from his leather briefcase. Douglas stopped dead in his tracks, swallowing hard as the reality of his trapped situation set in. "I am not going to stand here and listen to the paranoid, delusional ramblings of a sick old man." Douglas continued, his voice rising in pitch as he desperately searched the room for a non-existent way out. "If you do not step aside right this second, Harold, and let us walk freely out of this restaurant, I am going to pull out my phone and call the police immediately. I will have you officially arrested for criminal harassment and unlawful imprisonment, and I will make sure the judge signs the conservatorship tonight." I did not flinch, did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of fear. I simply tilted my head, letting a cold, terrifying smile slowly spread across my weathered face. I looked directly into his desperate, sweating eyes, enjoying the absolute destruction of his arrogant soul. "There is absolutely no need for you to call anyone Douglas." I whispered the words, cutting through the tense, heavy air like a sharpened steel blade. "They are already standing right outside the door." The heavy silence in the room was suffocating. Douglas kept his trembling finger pointed at my face, but he did not speak another word. He looked at the heavy mahogany doors, expecting federal agents to burst through and place him in handcuffs. But I was not going to let them leave this room in police custody until I had completely shattered every single delusion they held about themselves and each other. I gave a subtle nod to Oscar, who was standing quietly by the wall. Oscar reached into the pocket of his immaculate white chef coat and pulled out a small black remote control. He raised it toward the far end of the VIP dining room and pressed a single button. A massive flat-screen television, embedded deep within the expensive wood paneling, hummed to life. The sudden bright light bathed the dark room in a cold blue glow. The four traitors turned their heads toward the screen, instinctively drawn to the sudden illumination. The video feed began to play in crystal clear, high definition. It was security footage from the hidden camera I had installed in the formal living room of our suburban estate. The timestamp in the corner indicated it was recorded late at night, just a few weeks ago, right after Nicholas and Samantha had celebrated their lavish wedding reception. I had paid for that entire wedding while they secretly mocked me behind my back. Now they were going to pay the ultimate price for their arrogance. The audio blasted through the high-quality surround sound speakers of the restaurant VIP room. Patricia and Douglas appeared on the screen, sitting close together on my expensive leather sofa. Patricia was holding a glass of my best vintage wine, laughing softly. On the screen, Douglas leaned in and kissed her, aggressively wrapping his hands around her neck. The Patricia standing in the restaurant gasped loudly, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. The undeniable, indisputable evidence of her disgusting infidelity was being broadcast in massive proportions right in front of her own son. On the video feed, Patricia pulled away from Douglas and smiled a wicked, venomous smile. She told him how much she despised waking up in the same house as me. She complained about my old habits, my calloused hands, and my refusal to sell the commercial real estate. Then the conversation on the video shifted to their ultimate master plan. Douglas laughed, a slick, arrogant sound that echoed through the restaurant speakers. He told Patricia that the poison pills were slowly eroding my cognitive functions perfectly. He boasted about how incredibly easy it was going to be to forge the medical evaluations and lock me away in a padded psychiatric cell until I eventually died of a supposed heart attack. But the most devastating part was yet to come. Douglas looked at Patricia on the screen and brought up Nicholas. He called my son a complete gullible fool. He bragged about using Nicholas and his pathetic failing tech startup as a convenient financial laundry machine to wash the stolen real estate money before transferring it to their illicit offshore accounts. Patricia just laughed in agreement, calling her own son a useful idiot who was too busy showing off his leased sports cars to ever look at a real financial audit. I shifted my gaze away from the massive screen and looked directly at Nicholas. The false, arrogant corporate executive was completely gone. He stood perfectly still, staring at the glowing monitor with wide, terrified eyes. His chest heaved with shallow, erratic breaths. He was watching his beloved mother passionately kiss the financial advisor he had trusted with his entire life. He was listening to the two people he relied on most completely mock his intelligence and outline how they were actively using his fake company to commit federal fraud. The sheer weight of the absolute betrayal crushed him from the inside out. His knees buckled under the immense psychological pressure, and he collapsed onto the hardwood floor. He did not scream or cry. He just stared blankly at the shattered pieces of his entire reality, unable to process the magnificent depth of the lies that had completely surrounded his existence. Samantha had been standing near the edge of the dining table, but as the horrific confessions echoed through the room, her survival instincts kicked into maximum overdrive. She was a ruthless gold digger, but she was not a fool. She realized instantly that this was no longer just a simple family financial dispute or a tragic bankruptcy. This was a massive criminal conspiracy involving attempted murder, severe fraud, and federal authorities. She looked at Nicholas weeping pathetically on the floor, and then looked at Patricia, who was trembling in sheer terror. Samantha wanted absolutely nothing to do with the sinking ship that was currently completely engulfed in flames. She slowly and quietly began to back away, stepping cautiously toward the heavy mahogany double doors. She was desperately searching for a clean escape route, hoping to slip out into the night and deny she ever knew any of them. But Timothy Dawson simply stepped sideways, blocking her only path out of the room with his broad shoulders and a cold, unforgiving smile. She was trapped in the slaughterhouse with the rest of them. The audio continued to play, filling the tense air with their toxic secrets. Patricia finally snapped. The humiliation of being exposed as an unfaithful wife, a treacherous mother, and a violent criminal in front of everyone pushed her fragile, arrogant mind completely over the edge into sheer madness. She could not accept the absolute destruction of her perfect social image. "It is a lie," she screamed, her voice tearing through the room like a violent siren. She pointed a shaking manicured finger at the glowing television screen. "It is a deep fake," she yelled hysterically, stomping her feet against the hardwood floor. "Harold paid someone to make that video. It is artificial intelligence. I never said those things. I never touched Douglas. He is trying to frame us." Her frantic denials were absolutely pathetic. She was aggressively lying to a room full of people who had just watched her commit the crimes in high definition. Patricia looked around desperately, searching for anyone to believe her frantic delusions. But Douglas was staring at the floor in defeated silence, and Nicholas was entirely catatonic. Driven by pure manic desperation, Patricia grabbed an empty heavy crystal wine bottle from the center of the dining table. She let out a guttural animalistic scream and charged directly at the large flat-screen television. She swung the heavy crystal bottle with all her remaining strength, violently smashing it into the center of the glowing monitor. The expensive screen exploded in a shower of sparks and jagged black glass. The room plunged into sudden darkness, illuminated only by the soft glow of the crystal chandeliers. Patricia stood panting heavily, dropping the broken neck of the wine bottle onto the floor. Her hands were bleeding slightly, but she stared at the destroyed television with a twisted, triumphant smile, as if breaking the screen had somehow magically erased all the evidence of her horrific crimes. I did not move a single muscle to stop her violent outburst. I simply stood there perfectly calm, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored suit jacket. I let the silence settle over the room once again, allowing the sheer gravity of her psychotic breakdown to fully sink in. Patricia turned around to face me, her chest heaving, her eyes wild and bloodshot. "The evidence is completely gone," she hissed maliciously, a terrifying smile spreading across her pale face. "You have absolutely nothing on us, Harold. You are just a crazy old man making up stories. No one is ever going to believe you." I looked at her with an expression of absolute freezing pity. I shook my head slowly, taking one deliberate step closer to the woman who had tried to bury me alive. "You really do not understand how the modern world works." "Do you, Patricia?" I said, my low, booming voice easily cutting through her manic delusions. "That screen was just a simple monitor. The actual video files, the audio recordings of your hired thugs confessing to the kidnapping plot, the forged bank transfers, and the illegal medical evaluations are all sitting securely on multiple encrypted cloud servers. I have already sent a complete synchronized digital copy to the district attorney, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the State Medical Board." Patricia froze, her twisted, triumphant smile instantly vanishing. The reality of my words slammed into her with the force of a speeding freight train. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my secure mobile phone. I tapped the screen once, illuminating my face in the dim light. "I have played your pathetic little game for months." I continued speaking with a cold, mechanical precision. "I swallowed your poisoned pills. I played the weak, senile fool. I watched you aggressively dismantle my life and plan my funeral with absolute delight. But the game is officially over, Patricia. You are completely out of moves, and you are completely out of time." Douglas finally found his voice, stepping forward with his hands raised in a desperate, pleading gesture. "Harold!" "Wait," he stammered nervously, sweating profusely through his expensive suit. "We can negotiate a settlement. I can return the money I took. I can sign over all the offshore accounts to you right now. We do not need to involve the police in this family dispute. Please, Harold, I will do whatever you want." I looked at the slick financial advisor, the parasite who had slept with my wife and plotted to steal my entire legacy. I let a slow, terrifying smile spread across my face as I slipped my phone back into my pocket. "I do not negotiate with desperate criminals, Douglas," I whispered, the final devastating blow. "And as I told you earlier, there is absolutely no need to involve the police anymore." I stepped slightly to the side, gesturing toward the heavy mahogany double doors behind me. "Because the federal agents have been standing in the hallway, listening to this entire glorious conversation for the last 20 minutes. The shattered glass of the television screen crunched under my polished leather shoes as I took another deliberate step toward the dining table. Patricia was breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling in rapid, erratic bursts. She looked desperately at the dark, broken monitor, as if she could somehow reverse time and unbreak it, but the truth was already out in the open air. I reached out and took a thick, yellow manila envelope from Timothy. The heavy paper slapped against the mahogany table right next to the silver dome and the plastic bottle of pills. I did not raise my voice, but the sheer absolute authority in my tone forced all of them to look down at the documents spilling out onto the white linen tablecloth. "These are official certified toxicology reports, From the best private laboratory in the state, I said, watching Patricia slowly lose the remaining color in her face. For the past 6 months, you firmly believed you were slowly dissolving my brain tissue with a steady daily dose of heavy metals. You thought you were brilliant, Patricia. You thought crushing those lethal capsules into my morning coffee and my evening meals was the perfect, undetectable crime. But you never realized that my blood work was being monitored every single week by a private physician who answers only to me. The documents on the table detail every exact trace of the poison you purchased. They detail the exact timeline of your attempted murder and the specific chemical breakdown of the toxins you used to destroy my nervous system. Patricia shook her head frantically, her manicured hands gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned entirely white. She stammered pathetically, claiming that the pills were just dietary supplements, claiming that she only wanted me to be healthy and strong. It was a miserable, weak defense from a woman who had finally run out of lies. I leaned forward, resting my hands firmly on the solid wood table. I told her that I had figured out her sick little game the very first week my hands started to tremor and my vision began to blur. I told her how I had secretly replaced her lethal capsules with simple sugar pills months ago, meticulously dumping her actual poison down the bathroom drain every single night while she slept peacefully down the hall. I let her fully absorb the devastating reality that she had been playing a dangerous, lethal game against an opponent who had completely rigged the board from the very beginning. But the medical reports were only the first layer of their absolute destruction. I reached into my tailored suit jacket and pulled out my secure mobile phone. I tapped the screen and maximized the volume, connecting it seamlessly to the restaurant's central audio system through Oscar Secure Network. I wanted them to hear their own violent sins echoing through the room. I pressed play, and the terrified guttural voices of the two massive thugs filled the elegant dining space. The audio was crystal clear and completely unforgiving. Every single guest at the table heard the heavy, ragged breathing of the mercenaries trapped in my master bedroom closet. They heard the thugs frantically begging for their lives with the cold steel barrel of my shotgun resting directly against their sweating foreheads. And then the ultimate fatal confession echoed through the crystal chandeliers above us. The lead thug explicitly stated Patricia's name. He detailed exactly how she had handed over $10,000 in pure, untraceable cash to orchestrate my violent midnight kidnapping. He detailed the fake medical commitment papers she had provided and the exact route they were supposed to take to the corrupt private asylum. Then the second thug voice chimed in, completely exposing Douglas. He confessed that the slick financial advisor had brokered the entire illegal deal, meeting them in a dark alley behind a downtown hotel to arrange the logistics of my permanent disappearance. I stopped the audio recording, and the silence that followed was suffocating and absolute. There was absolutely no room for negotiation and no possible legal loophole for them to crawl through. The evidence was irrefutable and perfectly documented. Attempted murder, aggravated kidnapping, criminal conspiracy, and severe financial fraud were all perfectly preserved on multiple encrypted servers. I turned my gaze away from Patricia and locked my eyes directly onto Douglas. The arrogant wealth manager was sweating profusely now, his expensive custom Italian suit clinging tightly to his damp skin. He looked exactly like a cornered rat, frantically searching the room for a non-existent exit. He had always believed he was the smartest man in any room, hiding behind complex legal jargon and impenetrable corporate structures. But he was nothing more than a cheap common thief, and I was about to strip away his final remaining delusion. I gestured to Timothy, who produced a second, much thicker binder from his heavy leather briefcase. Timothy dropped the binder directly in front of Douglas. The heavy thud made the corrupt advisor flinch violently, as if he had been physically struck. I told Douglas that those specific ledgers were not my offshore accounts. I told him they were complete unredacted copies of his own secret illicit banking records. They were the very same ghost accounts he had been using to hide the money He actively stole from my massive real estate empire. But the ultimate devastating twist was not for Douglas, it was reserved entirely for Patricia. I looked at my treacherous wife and told her to read the bottom line of the financial transfers documented on the exposed pages. I explained with cold, brutal precision that Douglas had not just been stealing from me all these years. He had been actively siphoning massive amounts of cash directly out of their shared illicit accounts. For the past 3 weeks, while he was whispering sweet romantic promises in her ear and plotting our messy divorce, he was systematically draining her stolen funds. He had already purchased a one-way first-class ticket to a country with no extradition treaty, and he was fully prepared to abandon her the very moment the police inevitably started asking questions. The sudden realization hit Patricia like a physical, violent blow to the chest. She slowly turned her head to look at Douglas, her eyes wide with a terrifying mixture of ultimate betrayal and pure homicidal rage. The unholy alliance of traitors instantly and completely imploded right in front of my eyes. She realized that she had willingly thrown away 45 years of a stable, wealthy marriage for a slick coward who saw her entirely as a disposable temporary asset. Patricia lunged across the table, screaming vicious insults at the man she had been sleeping with, scratching desperately at his expensive suit. Douglas tried to step backward, raising his hands in a pathetic defensive gesture, but there was absolutely nowhere for him to run. He collapsed heavily into the velvet dining chair, burying his sweating face in his trembling hands, trying to block out her piercing screams. His lucrative career, his prestigious country club memberships, his freedom, and his entire life were permanently and completely over. Nicholas remained on the hardwood floor, paralyzed by the sheer catastrophic magnitude of the destruction happening around him. He had lost his protective father, his billionaire inheritance, his fake startup company, and any shred of respect he ever possessed. Samantha remained pressed tightly against the expensive floral wallpaper, wishing she could melt directly into the plaster and completely disappear from this waking nightmare. They were completely broken, stripped of all their arrogant pride, and left entirely with the devastating, crushing consequences of their own toxic greed. I stood perfectly still, letting the absolute totality of my hard-earned victory wash over me. The commercial empire I had built with calloused hands and 70-hour work weeks was entirely safe, securely resting in a trust they could never possibly touch. The parasites had been surgically removed, and the rotten foundation of my family had been completely demolished, so that I could finally find some measure of peace. I took one slow, deep breath, savoring the cool, clean air of absolute freedom. Suddenly, the heavy mahogany double doors of the VIP dining room burst open with a loud, violent crash that physically shook the walls. A tactical team of federal agents dressed in dark body armor and local police officers in crisp blue uniforms swarmed into the elegant room. Their heavy black boots stomped aggressively against the polished hardwood floor, moving with military precision. The lead federal agent stepped forward, producing a thick stack of finalized emergency arrest warrants from his tactical vest. The harsh metallic clinking of heavy steel handcuffs filled the air, completely drowning out the soft romantic music playing faintly in the background of the restaurant. The agents fanned out rapidly across the room, circling the long dining table, their expressions completely devoid of any pity or hesitation. The ultimate legal judgment had officially arrived, and the only question remaining in the cold, tense air was which of these arrogant, desperate traitors was going to feel the cold steel locked around their wrists first. The heavy mahogany doors of the VIP room remained wide open as the swarm of uniform officers and federal agents completely took over the elegant space. The soft romantic music playing through the restaurant speakers was abruptly cut off, leaving only the heavy, aggressive sound of tactical boots stepping onto the polished hardwood floor. The lead federal agent, a tall, imposing man with a silver badge gleaming on his chest, walked directly toward the long dining table. He did not look at the shattered crystal on the floor or the destroyed television screen hanging on the wall. He looked directly at the traitors who were now completely surrounded with absolutely no avenue for escape. Patricia tried to back away, but her legs finally gave out under the immense, crushing weight of her immediate reality. She collapsed into her velvet chair, her perfectly styled blonde hair completely ruined, and her expensive imported silk dress stained with spilled vintage wine. The lead agent pulled a thick stack of official warrants from his dark tactical vest and began to read them aloud. His voice was loud, mechanical, and entirely devoid of any human sympathy. He looked directly at Patricia and Douglas, formally declaring that they were under immediate emergency arrest for conspiracy to commit aggravated kidnapping, attempted murder, and severe federal financial fraud. Douglas did not even try to fight back or manipulate his way out of the corner. The slick, arrogant wealth manager who had spent his entire career bending the law was completely paralyzed by the absolute destruction of his universe. When two federal agents grabbed his arms and violently twisted them behind his back, forcing the cold, heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists, he just stared blankly at the stained tablecloth. His lucrative career, his prestigious country club memberships, and his entire luxurious life were instantly and permanently erased. He was no longer a powerful, untouchable financial advisor. He was just a common, disgraced criminal being dragged away to a federal prison cell. Patricia, however, completely lost whatever fragile grip she still maintained on her sanity. As the female officer approached her with the heavy metal handcuffs, Patricia let out a desperate, guttural scream that echoed violently through the entire restaurant. She violently shoved the officer away and threw herself onto the hardwood floor, crawling desperately toward my polished leather shoes. The broken glass from the shattered champagne flute cut deeply into her bare knees, but she did not seem to register the physical pain. She grabbed the fabric of my tailored suit pants, weeping uncontrollably and leaving dark, wet stains on the expensive material. "Harold, please, you have to stop them," she begged, her voice cracking into a pathetic, desperate wail. "I am your wife, Harold. I am your only wife. I love you. We built this magnificent life together for 45 long years. You cannot let them take me away to a dark prison cell. I will do whatever you want. I will sign the divorce papers tonight. I will give you everything back. Please, Harold, you are the only husband I have ever loved." I stood perfectly still, looking down at the woman who had spent the last 6 months happily crushing toxic heavy metals into my morning coffee. I did not move my leg away from her desperate, frantic grip, but I also did not offer her a single ounce of comfort. I looked at her with eyes that were completely dead, completely hollow, and utterly devoid of any lingering trace of pity or marital devotion. I told her that she lost the absolute right to call herself my wife the very first time she handed Douglas the keys to my house, and the very first time she placed a poisoned pill onto my dinner plate. The female officer stepped forward, grabbing Patricia by her shaking shoulders and forcefully pulling her off the floor. Patricia kicked and screamed violently, cursing my name and begging for mercy as they locked the heavy steel cuffs around her wrists and dragged her aggressively out of the VIP room. The lead agent then turned his cold, unforgiving gaze toward Nicholas. My arrogant son was still kneeling on the floor, surrounded by the absolute wreckage of the celebratory dinner he had so eagerly attended just an hour ago. The agent formally read the next warrant, declaring Nicholas under immediate arrest for active complicity in severe financial fraud and for intentionally forging federal bank loan documents using stolen collateral. Nicholas did not cry for his mother, who was currently screaming her lungs out in the hallway. He did not look at his beautiful wife, Samantha, who was actively shrinking against the expensive floral wallpaper, trying desperately to become completely invisible to the armed police officers. Instead, my son looked up at me with tears streaming rapidly down his pale, sweating face. He crawled forward on his hands and knees, placing his trembling fingers on the toes of my shoes. "Dad, please, you have to save me," Nicholas begged, his voice vibrating with pure, pathetic terror. "I did not know they were going to kill you, Dad. I swear to God, I did not know about the poison or the violent kidnappers. I just wanted the commercial land to save my failing tech startup. Please, Dad, write a massive check and bail me out. Call your brilliant lawyers and fix this mess. My company is completely bankrupt, and if I go to federal prison, my entire life is completely over. I am your only son, Dad. Please do not let them take my life away. I looked down at the boy I had raised with my own two calloused hands. The boy I had patiently taught to ride a bicycle, and the boy I had so proudly watched graduate from university. But the broken weeping man crying on the restaurant floor was not my son. He was a greedy, entitled parasite who had actively celebrated my supposed mental destruction simply because he wanted to lease private jets and impress his wealthy friends. I leaned down slightly, my voice dropping into a low, freezing whisper that only he could hear. I told him that my real son died the exact moment he blindly handed my hard-earned legacy over to a woman who treated him like an automatic teller machine, and a mother who used his fake company as a criminal laundry service. I stood back up straight and gave the federal agent a slow, deliberate nod. Two heavy officers grabbed Nicholas by the collar of his custom-tailored designer suit, lifting his dead weight completely off the floor. Nicholas sobbed openly, weeping like a terrified, abandoned child, as the cold steel handcuffs clicked loudly and permanently around his wrists. He begged and pleaded, calling out my name over and over again as they dragged him out of the dining room. But I did not even blink. I did not turn my head to watch him go. I simply severed the rotten branch and let it fall completely into the roaring fire. Samantha remained frozen against the wall, her expensive designer dress trembling slightly with her rapid breathing. The lead agent looked at her, checking his official notepad. He asked Timothy Dawson if there were any pending criminal charges for the young daughter-in-law. Timothy adjusted his glasses and calmly stated that she was not directly involved in the physical kidnapping plot or the financial forgery. She was merely a greedy, opportunistic gold digger who had fortunately arrived too late to commit any actionable federal crimes. The agent nodded, keeping his face completely neutral, and simply ordered her to leave the active crime scene immediately. Samantha did not hesitate for a single second. She did not ask the officers where they were taking her new husband. She did not ask how she could help him pay for a criminal defense lawyer. She just grabbed her expensive imported leather purse, kept her head down, and practically ran out of the heavy mahogany doors, disappearing completely into the dark city streets without looking back. She was the absolute definition of a financial parasite, abandoning a dead host to desperately seek another wealthy victim. Within 10 minutes, the VIP dining room was completely cleared of the heavily armed police officers and the desperate traders. I walked slowly over to the large shattered window, looking out onto the dark pavement below. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers painted the quiet street with a harsh, rhythmic glow. I watched silently as the officers forced Douglas, Patricia, and Nicholas into the back seats of separate armored vehicles, pushing their heads down to clear the doorframes. The heavy metal doors slammed shut with a final devastating thud, echoing through the night. The sirens wailed loudly, cutting through the cool air as the police convoy sped away, tearing down the asphalt and completely vanishing into the deep shadows of the city. The silence that washed over the elegant restaurant was profound and absolute. It was not the heavy, suffocating silence of an unspoken lie or a toxic, broken marriage. It was the crisp, clean, refreshing silence of a violent, brutal storm that had finally passed, leaving the air fresh and entirely breathable. Timothy Dawson packed his heavy legal documents back into his vintage leather briefcase, snapping the brass locks shut with a satisfying click. He stepped forward, placing a firm, highly respectful hand on my shoulder. He told me that the offshore trust was completely secure, that the funds were entirely untouchable, and that the federal prosecutors had absolutely everything they needed to lock the three traders away for decades. He gave me a polite, knowing nod and walked quietly out of the room, leaving me entirely alone with my oldest trusted friend. Oscar stepped forward, wearing his immaculate, pristine white chef coat, and began to slowly pick up the shattered pieces of the expensive crystal glasses scattered across the polished hardwood floor. I looked around the destroyed VIP room, taking in the overturned velvet chairs, the spilled vintage wine pooling on the rug, and the plastic bottle of poisoned pills still resting quietly under the polished silver dome. The magnificent commercial empire I had built with 70-hour work weeks and endless invisible sacrifices, was completely safe. The toxic, greedy parasites had been surgically extracted from my veins, and the rotten, deceitful foundation of my family had been entirely demolished. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cool, clean air fill my tired lungs completely. For the first time in 45 long, agonizing years, I had absolutely no one to compromise for. I had no ungrateful, arrogant son to constantly bail out, and no treacherous, venomous wife to endlessly appease. I stood alone in the quiet, dimly lit restaurant, facing a future that was entirely empty, completely unpredictable, and absolutely brilliantly clean. Exactly 30 days had passed since the brutal storm swept through the VIP dining room and cleansed my entire existence. The passage of a single month had completely transformed my reality from a suffocating prison of lies into a quiet fortress of absolute solitude. I woke up every morning in my sprawling estate without the toxic presence of Patricia complaining about the catering or Nicholas demanding another massive financial bailout. The air in my home was finally pure, and I breathed it in with the profound appreciation of a man who had narrowly escaped a slow, agonizing suffocation. Today, however, the quiet peace of my new life was temporarily suspended. The ultimate legal reckoning had officially arrived, and I was completely prepared to watch the final ashes of my treacherous family scatter into the cold wind. I walked through the heavy glass doors of the district courthouse, my polished leather shoes clicking sharply against the pristine white marble floor. Timothy Dawson walked respectfully by my side, carrying his heavy leather briefcase filled with the finalized financial audits and the irrevocable digital evidence of their horrific crimes. The courthouse hallway was a long, imposing corridor of dark wood and cold stone designed specifically to make guilty men tremble before they faced their ultimate judgment. We navigated through the crowd of lawyers and nervous defendants, moving with a steady, deliberate purpose. We were just a few yards away from the heavy oak doors of courtroom number 4, when a sudden, desperate movement in the shadows caught my attention. Samantha stepped directly into the center of the hallway, physically blocking my path to the courtroom. She looked absolutely pathetic, but it was a carefully constructed, artificial kind of pathetic. She was wearing a muted gray dress that was meant to project humility, but I immediately recognized the expensive designer stitching and the premium imported fabric. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a messy knot, and her face was entirely devoid of her usual heavy makeup meant to highlight the dark circles under her eyes. She was aggressively playing the role of the innocent, traumatized victim who had been tragically caught in the crossfire of a violent family dispute. I knew perfectly well that she had officially filed for a rapid divorce from Nicholas the very morning after his humiliating arrest. She had ruthlessly abandoned her sinking husband the second she realized his billionaire inheritance was completely non-existent, and his fake tech startup was a criminal fraud. Now she was standing in front of me, wringing her hands together and letting large theatrical tears roll slowly down her pale cheeks. She looked at me with wide, pleading eyes, trying desperately to resurrect the image of the sweet, loving daughter-in-law she had pretended to be for the past 2 years. "Harold, please wait," she whispered, her voice trembling with an expertly rehearsed emotional fragility. "I just need 5 minutes of your time, Harold. Please do not walk away from me." I stopped walking, but I did not offer her a single inch of comfort or a single word of greeting. I simply stood there looking down at her with an expression of absolute freezing emptiness. She took my silence as an invitation to launch into her pathetic, rehearsed monologue. She told me how absolutely devastated she was by the horrific actions of Patricia and Douglas. She claimed she had absolutely no idea that Nicholas was involved in the violent kidnapping plot or the federal financial fraud. She wept loudly, echoing through the cold marble hallway, claiming that the scandal had completely ruined her social reputation and left her entirely destitute. She told me that she was currently living in a cheap rented room and that her credit cards were completely blocked. Then she finally reached the actual point of her theatrical ambush. She reached out with a trembling hand, trying to touch the sleeve of my tailored suit jacket. She begged me for a temporary financial allowance, just a small monthly stipend, to help her survive until the divorce was finalized. She called me her only real family and swore she would pay back every single penny once she found a comfortable corporate job. I did not physically flinch or step back, but I let my cold, hollow gaze drop down to her trembling hand until she slowly pulled it away in sheer, awkward terror. I looked at this ambitious, greedy parasite who had actively celebrated my supposed mental deterioration while drinking expensive champagne at my dining table. She had eagerly participated in my financial execution, and now she was weeping on the courthouse floor, demanding a severance package for her failed betrayal. I did not raise my voice or show a single trace of anger. I simply looked right through her as if she were a piece of discarded trash blowing across an empty street. I told her that her fake tears were an absolute insult to my intelligence. I reminded her that she had sprinted out of the restaurant the exact second the federal agents arrived, leaving her weeping husband to face a massive federal prison sentence entirely alone. I told her that she was nothing but a cheap, opportunistic scavenger who had foolishly attached herself to the wrong host, and now she was starving because the host was finally awake. Her theatrical tears stopped instantly. The fragile, traumatized victim vanished completely, replaced by the cold, calculating woman who realized her pathetic emotional manipulation had failed spectacularly. She stared at me with wide, terrified eyes as the freezing reality of her complete destitution finally set in. But I was not finished dismantling her arrogant existence. I turned my head slightly and looked calmly at my brilliant lawyer. "Timothy," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the quiet corridor. When we arrived at the courthouse this morning, I noticed a brand new silver luxury sports car parked illegally in the restricted visitor lot. Samantha physically flinched as if I had struck her across the face. I continued speaking with brutal mechanical precision. I told Timothy that I distinctly recognized the license plate because that specific luxury vehicle was purchased 6 months ago using a premium corporate credit card that was registered entirely under my primary business account. I explained that Nicholas had forged my signature to secure the credit line and then handed the premium card directly to his greedy new wife as a lavish wedding gift. Timothy adjusted his glasses and nodded slowly, a cold, professional smile spreading across his face. I looked back at Samantha, whose face had turned the color of dead ash. I told Timothy to make a phone call right this second. I ordered him to contact my private security team and have that stolen silver sports car aggressively towed and permanently repossessed before the afternoon session even began. I told him to cancel the associated credit line immediately and to flag every single unauthorized purchase she had made over the past 6 months as active financial fraud. I told him to make sure she walked out of this courthouse today with absolutely nothing but the expensive designer dress on her back and the massive crushing weight of her own catastrophic failures. Samantha opened her mouth to scream or protest or beg for mercy, but her throat was completely paralyzed by the sheer totality of her destruction. She realized that she was not just losing her lavish allowance, she was losing her transportation, her remaining stolen assets, and her entire false identity. She was going to have to walk for miles in her expensive designer shoes back to whatever miserable rented room she had managed to secure. I did not wait to watch her completely break down on the cold marble floor. I simply stepped around her trembling, paralyzed body, moving with the heavy, unstoppable momentum of a massive freight train. I left her standing alone in the dark shadows of the corridor, completely erased from my universe and entirely irrelevant to my future. Timothy and I reached the heavy oak double doors of courtroom number 4. I reached out and pushed them open, stepping directly into the bright, sterile light of the ultimate legal battleground. The courtroom was vast and intimidating, with heavy wood paneling and tall stained glass windows that offered no warmth or comfort. The entire space was suffocatingly quiet, filled only with the soft, nervous shuffling of legal papers and the heavy breathing of desperate criminals. I walked slowly down the center aisle, completely ignoring the crowded gallery of journalists and curious spectators who had gathered to witness the dramatic conclusion of the local most notorious family scandal. I kept my posture perfectly straight and my shoulders broad, radiating absolute undisputed authority. I stopped at the front row of the polished wooden benches and looked directly at the defense tables. Patricia Douglas and Nicholas were sitting together, looking absolutely unrecognizable in their bright orange federal prison uniforms. Their expensive tailored suits and designer dresses had been completely stripped away, leaving them looking small, pathetic, and utterly defeated. They were shackled at the wrists and ankles, the heavy steel chains clinking softly every time they moved. Patricia looked a decade older, her blonde hair completely gray and unkempt, her arrogant pride entirely shattered by 30 days in a cold concrete cell. Nicholas had his head bowed, staring blindly at his shackled hands, weeping silently and endlessly. Douglas looked like a terrified, trapped rat, nervously chewing on his bottom lip and sweating profusely under the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom. They slowly turned their heads and looked at me as I took my seat right behind the federal prosecutor's desk. They did not see the weak, fragile old man they had so happily tried to poison and bury alive. They saw the architect of their absolute destruction. They saw the king who had silently orchestrated their entire downfall while pretending to be a helpless, senile fool. The heavy wooden door behind the bench swung open, and the bailiff instructed the entire courtroom to rise. The honorable judge took his seat, his face stern and completely unforgiving. The session was officially called to order, and the final sentencing phase was about to begin. The massive federal charges of attempted murder, aggravated kidnapping, and severe financial fraud carried sentences that would guarantee they all died in dark prison cells. But the ultimate severity of their punishment, the absolute finality of their destruction, rested entirely on the testimony of a single key witness. The judge adjusted his microphone and called my name, commanding me to take the stand. I stood up slowly, buttoning my custom charcoal suit jacket, feeling the cold, terrified eyes of my treacherous family burning into my back. I walked steadily toward the witness box, completely prepared to deliver the final devastating blow that would bury them all forever. The federal prosecutor called my name, and the heavy silence in courtroom number 4 deepened into an absolute suffocating vacuum. I stepped up into the polished wooden witness box, feeling the smooth, varnished railing under my calloused hands. The bailiff asked me to swear to tell the whole truth, and I placed my right hand firmly on the leather-bound book. I stated my full name for the official court record, my voice booming across the vast, sterile room. The judge leaned forward, looking down at me from his elevated bench. He possessed a stern, unforgiving face with deep wrinkles etched around his mouth. He asked if I was completely prepared to deliver my victim impact statement, and I gave him a slow, deliberate nod. I turned my head slowly and looked directly at the defense table. Patricia Douglas and Nicholas sat frozen in their bright orange federal prison uniforms. They looked like pathetic, broken shells of the arrogant predators they used to be. Their expensive haircuts were completely ruined, and their posture was curled inward as if they were physically trying to hide from my gaze. The defense attorneys had spent the entire morning begging for judicial leniency. They had presented pathetic arguments about Patricia suffering from emotional distress and Douglas making terrible lapses in professional judgment. They painted Nicholas as a naive, misguided youth who was entirely manipulated by older criminals. It was a disgusting theatrical performance meant to manufacture artificial sympathy. But I was not going to allow a single ounce of mercy to exist in this room. I took a deep breath and prepared to completely dismantle their pathetic, fabricated defenses. I began my testimony by describing the exact reality of my daily life over the past 6 months. I told the judge how I built a massive commercial real estate empire through 45 years of grueling 70-hour work weeks. I explained how I sacrificed my own personal happiness to provide an absolute life of luxury for the woman sitting at the defense table. I looked directly at Patricia and told the court how she repaid my lifelong devotion. I detailed the exact moment I realized my tea tasted strange and how my hands began to violently shake. I described the sheer psychological torture of knowing the woman I shared a bed with was actively mixing toxic heavy metals into my morning coffee. I explained how I had to play the role of a terrified, senile old man just to gather enough evidence to survive her lethal daily routine. Patricia put her head down on the table, weeping loudly, but her tears were completely empty. She was only crying because her perfect, comfortable life was entirely destroyed, not because she felt a single shred of genuine human remorse. I did not let her fake tears interrupt my steady, mechanical delivery. I shifted my attention to the slick, disgraced wealth manager sitting next to her. I told the court about Douglas and his absolute breach of professional trust. I explained how he smiled in my face and shook my hand while actively draining my commercial accounts and sleeping with my treacherous wife. He thought he was the smartest man in the room, hiding his theft behind complex offshore trusts and sophisticated legal jargon. I detailed how he orchestrated the violent midnight kidnapping plot, paying 2 armed thugs to drag me out of my own home and lock me away in a corrupt psychiatric ward. Douglas sat perfectly still, staring blankly at the polished wooden table. He knew his lucrative career and his arrogant country club lifestyle were permanently buried. I made sure the judge understood that Douglas was not a victim of circumstance, but a ruthless, calculating, white-collar predator who preyed entirely on the elderly and the vulnerable. Then I looked at Nicholas, my only son. The boy I had patiently taught to ride a bicycle and proudly sent to the most expensive private universities. I told the court how I had actively funded his lavish lifestyle and his failing fake technology startup. I explained how he completely abandoned his fundamental morality just to lease expensive sports cars and impress his greedy, shallow wife. I detailed his active participation in the financial forgery and his willing blindness to the fact that his own mother was actively poisoning me. Nicholas sobbed openly, his thin shoulders shaking violently under his orange uniform. He had begged me for a financial bailout the night of the restaurant confrontation, but I reminded the court that he only cared about his own survival. He never cared that his father was dying. I stated clearly that blood relations meant absolutely nothing when that blood was completely poisoned by toxic, unadulterated greed. He chose his path, and now he had to face the brutal, concrete reality of his own arrogant decisions. The courtroom was completely silent. The gallery of journalists and spectators hung onto every single word I spoke. The federal prosecutor asked if I had any final remarks before the court moved to the official sentencing phase. I stood perfectly straight, gripping the edges of the witness box. I looked at the judge and delivered the absolute truth of my entire existence. I told him that the 3 traitors sitting before him never saw me as a devoted husband or a loving, protective father. They only saw me as a pathetic, weak obstacle standing between them and my massive financial legacy. I told the courtroom that they simply saw me as an old sheep that needed to be aggressively bled dry. They believed my advanced age made me entirely disposable and inherently worthless. I raised my voice slightly, ensuring every single person in the room felt the heavy, crushing weight of my final statement. I demanded that absolute justice must be served today so that no other old person ever has to experience this profound, devastating humiliation. I stepped down from the polished witness box and walked slowly back to my seat next to Timothy Dawson. The heavy silence in the courtroom was a physical entity pressing down on the shoulders of the guilty. The honorable judge sat back in his tall leather chair, his face a mask of cold, unforgiving stone. He looked down at his thick stack of legal papers and adjusted his glasses. He stated that in his 30 years on the federal bench, he had never witnessed a more vile, calculated, and completely repulsive betrayal of family trust. He condemned their actions as the ultimate definition of human greed and moral bankruptcy. He told Patricia that her fake tears would buy her absolutely no sympathy in his courtroom. He told Douglas that his slick financial degrees were nothing but tools for common theft. He told Nicholas that his willing complicity in the destruction of his own family was a permanent stain on his soul. The judge reached for his heavy wooden gavel and raised it high into the cold, sterile air. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down against the sound block with a violent crack that echoed like a gunshot. The judge delivered the final devastating sentences with rapid mechanical precision. Patricia was sentenced to 35 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without any possibility of early parole. Douglas received exactly the same brutal sentence for his active orchestration of the kidnapping plot and the massive financial fraud. They would both die in cold, dark concrete cells completely stripped of their stolen wealth and their arrogant pride. Nicholas was sentenced to 5 solid years in federal prison for his active complicity and his illegal document forgery. My son collapsed completely onto the defense table, wailing like an abandoned, terrified child as the heavy steel chains rattled around his wrists and ankles. Federal marshals immediately stepped forward, grabbing the 3 traitors by their arms and dragging them aggressively toward the heavy side doors. They disappeared into the dark shadows of the holding cells, and the massive oak doors slammed shut behind them with a final, definitive thud. The storm was permanently over. The toxic, rotten branches had been completely severed and burned to ash. The gallery of spectators slowly began to stand up and filter out of the large double doors, whispering quietly about the absolute destruction they had just witnessed. Timothy Dawson packed his legal documents into his leather briefcase and gave me a firm, respectful handshake. I did not need to speak a single word to my brilliant lawyer, because the total victory was already echoing loudly through the empty wooden benches. I turned around and walked out of the heavy double doors of the district courthouse, stepping directly into the bright, warm afternoon sunlight. I took a deep, clean breath of the fresh city air, letting the absolute reality of my total freedom wash over my tired bones. My sprawling suburban estate would be entirely quiet tonight. There would be no venomous whispers in the hallways and no greedy plotting behind closed doors. My future was entirely empty, but it was finally beautifully and perfectly clean. The heavy iron gates of my sprawling suburban estate closed behind my car with a final definitive clank. I stepped out onto the pristine gravel driveway and looked up at the massive stone facade. For 4 decades, this house was supposed to be my ultimate sanctuary, but it had slowly morphed into a suffocating prison built entirely on lies and ungratefulness. Today, I was officially tearing down the invisible bars. I did not come back to reminisce or to mourn the pathetic illusion of my family. I came back to completely eradicate their physical memory from the face of the earth. Waiting for me in this grand foyer was a professional liquidation crew of 20 men dressed in matching gray uniforms. They stood in absolute silence, holding rolls of heavy industrial black trash bags, waiting for my direct orders. I did not give them a speech. I simply pointed up the grand, sweeping staircase and told them to absolutely empty every single room. I instructed them to leave absolutely nothing behind. I stood in the center of the massive living room and watched as the crew systematically dismantled Patricia's entire arrogant existence. They carried down hundreds of expensive imported silk dresses, designer shoes she had worn only once, and ridiculous diamond necklaces she had purchased using my stolen money. I did not flinch when a worker accidentally dropped her favorite crystal perfume bottle, shattering it across the hardwood floor. The sweet, cloying smell of her expensive perfume filled the air, but it only reminded me of the toxic poison she had crushed into my morning coffee. They packed it all into the heavy bags like toxic medical waste. Then they moved to Nicholas' old bedroom. The workers carried down his expensive golf clubs, his framed university diplomas that I had completely paid for, and his ridiculous silver trophies. One worker paused, holding a large framed family photograph we had taken in Hawaii 10 years ago. He looked at me, perhaps expecting a moment of sentimental hesitation from an old man. I looked at the glossy photo, remembering exactly how that specific day had unfolded. Patricia had complained endlessly about the ocean breeze ruining her hair, and Nicholas had spent the entire afternoon whining about the slow room service while drinking expensive cocktails on my tab. The smiles in the picture were completely fabricated. I looked the worker directly in the eyes and told him to throw it into the incinerator pile. I did not want a single photograph, a single piece of clothing, or a single lingering memory of those parasites polluting my clean air. By the late afternoon, the sprawling estate was entirely empty. The heavy wooden furniture, the expensive rugs, and the countless useless decorations were completely gone, loaded into massive moving trucks destined for the city landfill. The house echoed with a crisp, clean emptiness. The suffocating weight of their greed had been physically scrubbed from the walls. The front doorbell rang, echoing loudly through the empty halls. I opened the door to find my real estate agent standing nervously next to a young couple. The young woman was visibly pregnant, holding her husband's hand, with a look of genuine bright hope in her eyes. They stepped inside, looking around the massive empty space with absolute awe. I had instructed my agent to completely bypass the open market and find a young, struggling family who truly deserved a fortunate break. I remembered the very first day I bought this plot of land. I had stood in the dirt with calloused hands, hoping to build a strong foundation for a loving family. The foundation was never the problem. The people I invited inside were the poison. I stepped forward and interrupted their anxious whispers. I told the young man that I was selling the entire estate to them for exactly 1/4 of its actual market value. The young woman burst into tears of absolute pure joy, covering her face with her trembling hands. Her husband shook my hand with a crushing grip, thanking me over and over again, calling it an absolute miracle. I did not smile, but I felt a profound, deep warmth settle in my tired chest. I was intentionally replacing 40 years of toxic arrogance and deceit with a genuine foundation of love and new life. The house was finally going to fulfill its original intended purpose. The next morning, I sat in the polished glass office of Timothy Dawson. My brilliant lawyer slid a thick stack of finalized legal documents across his wide mahogany desk. I picked up my heavy gold pen and signed my name with smooth, deliberate strokes. I was not just transferring funds, I was officially establishing a massive private foundation dedicated entirely to the legal and financial protection of vulnerable elderly citizens. I had promised the judge in that cold courtroom that I would make sure no other old man or woman would ever have to suffer the profound, devastating humiliation I had endured. I instructed Timothy to use a massive portion of my liquidated assets to fund top-tier legal teams, private investigators, and secure medical facilities for seniors who were being actively abused by their own greedy children. I wanted to build an impenetrable fortress for the forgotten and the discarded. I wanted every arrogant, greedy child in the country to know that their vulnerable parents now had a heavily funded, invisible army standing right behind them. Timothy gathered the signed documents, placing them carefully into his leather briefcase. He looked at me with an expression of profound, absolute respect and wished me a safe journey. I walked out of the towering glass skyscraper and stepped directly into the bright, warm afternoon sunlight. A sleek black luxury car was idling quietly by the curb, waiting solely for my command. The driver stepped out and opened the heavy rear door for me. I looked down at the sidewalk. I had exactly 2 vintage leather suitcases resting by my polished shoes. They contained a few custom-tailored suits, some comfortable casual clothes, and my secure encrypted phone. I had absolutely nothing else. I did not own a sprawling suburban mansion anymore. I did not have an ungrateful, arrogant son waiting for his massive allowance. I did not have a treacherous, venomous wife plotting my slow, painful murder. The dark, heavy chains that had bound me to the earth for 4 decades were completely and permanently shattered. The past had been entirely washed away, leaving absolutely no trace of the nightmare I had survived. I stepped into the quiet, luxurious interior of the black car, and the driver gently closed the door, shutting out the noise of the busy city streets. He looked at me through the rearview mirror and politely asked where I wanted to go. I settled back into the soft leather seat, letting the cool air wash over my face. I looked out the tinted window at the endless, stretching horizon. I was a 70-year-old man with no family, no home, and no remaining obligations. But I was also a king who possessed an untouchable, massive fortune and an absolute pristine freedom that most men could never possibly fathom. I did not have a specific destination in mind, and for the very first time in my entire grueling life, that fact did not terrify me. It invigorated me. The entire world was sitting quietly at my feet, waiting to be completely rediscovered. The engine hummed with a deep, quiet power as the car smoothly pulled away from the curb, merging seamlessly into the fast-flowing traffic and carrying me forward into a brilliantly clean, absolutely empty unknown.